You can
This
see
conference will now be recorded.
we have quite a team, and of course this list is not at all inclusive, but there are a lot of people that have been working on this project and trying to get these maps out in a way in the face of COVID and in the face of a lot of the loss that you all are very well aware of and that we'll see here in detail coming up. So I want to thank everybody that's been on this team and all the partners and the volunteers that have been working with us. Many of you are on this call this morning, so I do want to really reach out and thank all of you and definitely make note that this is not the Chris Anastasio show, that this would not have been possible without quite a team of folks. So today I'm going to actually tag team this with my colleague Nate Morton, who's sitting next to me in the conference room. And we're going to go through kind of section by section, like Gary had said. We have kind of an agenda for this morning. We're going to delve into some of the details of how we create the maps. I think it's important that we're all sort of on the same page in terms of how these maps are produced, and hopefully give you kind of an overview of the complexity of these maps and really what these maps are intended for and how we use them at the district. Then we're going to go into each estuary. We're going to go starting north to south from Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound to Tampa Bay, and then Sarasota Bay, Lemon Bay, Charlotte Harbor, and then we'll kind of wrap up and talk a little bit about some of the next steps. And as Gary alluded, we're going to stop after each of these sections and do a little Q&A rather than wait for the entire thing to be done. And so hopefully we'll get to everyone's questions as soon as we can and stay on schedule. And Gary's going to keep us on track with time. So thank you, Gary, for that. So we'll just roll right into kind of the high-level overview of what is our seagrass mapping program. So at the district, we've been mapping seagrass since about 1988, and we continue to do so to this day. We have kind of two large areas that we map. We map the Springs Coast, which is roughly from Anclote Key north to Wakasasa Bay, which is near Cedar Key, and then the Sun Coast, which is from Clearwater Harbor, Tampa Bay, south to Charlotte Harbor. So all total, we've got about 3,800 square miles that we actually map. That's not to say that's how much seagrass there is, but that's the aerial extent of what we map. And in case you haven't figured it out yet, we are an aerial mapping program. So we collect imagery, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The timeline for how we map our cycle goes on a 4-year rotation for Springs Coast. So we started mapping Springs Coast in 2007, and we do it every 4 years. So 2020 is one of those years. Don't do the math because I know it doesn't make sense, but we did actually skip a year in order to make it in line with Suncoast. So 2020 was the entire coastline. Now today we're just going to focus on Suncoast. And Suncoast we do every 2 years. So the last mapping effort and what we'll be looking at in terms of change is 2018 to 2020. So I wanted to also just touch on our timeline. As I said earlier, it's a very complex process. So there's a lot that goes into creating these map products, from the initial flight acquisition all the way to the time that we actually will publish these final maps. So we hope to have the final map product ready for distribution for the public by probably mid-May. Today, April 16th, is where we're going to be presenting to you the preliminary results. So you'll see on this timeline, there's the independent accuracy assessment, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but just so everyone is aware, we are still conducting that assessment, and so we're not completed with that final accuracy assessment. Until that happens, we do not finalize the map. So that's why we're sort of going to show you the preliminary results with the final results coming in the next month or so. So what we're going to do now is kind of delve into really 3 phases of seagrass mapping. So there's the acquisition phase, the photo interpretation phase, and the field verification phase. And so we'll start out with the acquisition phase. So as you saw on the timeline before, we have an acquisition window between November and February, and there's a lot of reasons why we choose that time of the year. It's perhaps from an ecological perspective not the optimal time, but it is the best time to fly because of the clarity of the atmosphere and the weather conditions, which I'll talk about in a minute. The aircraft is loaded with a Leica airborne digital sensor. We use an ADS-100 on the 2020 maps. Technology is always improving, the quality of the imagery is always improving, and the imagery that we collected in 2020 had a 1-foot pixel resolution, so you can get pretty close and see some pretty minute detail. We do have a very strict go, no-go criteria for flight. They are assessed daily throughout that November to February window. And this is just kind of an example of some of the criteria that are used in order to make the go, no go decision, usually the morning of flight. So the tides, of course, have to be right. Wave heights have to be right. Water clarity as well is important. We need greater than or equal to 2 meters, optimal for each estuary in order to give the thumbs up for flight. And I know there's several of you on the call that were very instrumental in this part. So we rely very heavily on volunteers for the water clarity piece. We have Secchi discs, and people go out, in some cases almost daily in the morning, and they collect Secchi measurements. They enter it into our Survey 123 app, goes right to the PIs and to me, and we make that decision in the morning. So again, a shout out to all our volunteers who helped to provide that water clarity data. And then, of course, cloud cover is important. We don't want a cloudy day, but it's more important that we don't have mixed clouds and sun, because then it gets really obscured when you take the imagery. So 0% clouds is the best, but that's really at the discretion of our team. Sometimes if there's some clouds, we're okay with that as well. So once we collect the imagery, then we go into the post-processing phase. And so this is a multi-stepped process. It usually takes several months. The district has a very strict set of guidelines for aerial acquisition that we must adhere to. There are ground control survey points that are used. And then because these maps are designed specifically for the purpose of mapping seagrass, there's a lot of color balancing, pixel stretching. There's a lot of manipulation of the imagery in order to bring out the bottom. Anytime you're trying to map something under the water, you've got to really account for what's in the water column itself, and that often obscures the image. So there's a lot of that work that's done, and it's pretty amazing how these images can be enhanced in order to bring up the bottom. Sometimes there are areas that we have issues with, like passes. There's turbidity, there's various issues, and so we will oftentimes do reflights. So there are secondary image sets that are sometimes produced, really I would say almost always produced, because you're always going to have some areas where the clarity just wasn't right or something wasn't right. So we do reflights, and that's driven by this post-processing process. And then the final approval of the imagery themselves has to be done by our licensed survey supervisor. So they have to be signed off by a licensed surveyor before we accept the images. Now, once all that happens, that's when we can start getting into the actual mapping. But before we get into the photo interpretation, I wanted to spend a couple minutes on the field verification, because this is really important. We are collecting imagery from about 9,000 feet. And photo interpreters who have a breadth of experience and knowledge, both of the local area and of photo interpretation, are very good at what they do, but it would not be possible without the field verification. It's really important that we get heads in the water, so to speak, and verify what we're seeing on the aerial photography. So we have 3 types of field verification. We have what we call the PI ground truth. We have the quality control spot checks, and then the independent accuracy assessment, which I talked a little bit about earlier. All these field operations occur during or shortly after the time of acquisition, all the way to today. And so the spot checks are things that we do really throughout the mapping cycle. The PI ground truth and the independent accuracy assessment data collection typically happens during or shortly after acquisition. And remember, something we're going to talk about a lot when we go through the data is that these images were collected in 2020, but really they were collected in late 19 to early 2020. Remember the flight window, November to February. So when you look at these maps, what we're actually showing you is maps from imagery that was collected back then. So the first field verification flavor, if you will, is the PI ground truth. And Nate, if you want to speak to that.
Sure. And can everyone hear me okay? Because we're going to be using Chris's mic.
Yep, that's fine. We can hear you.
So yeah, for the Suncoast region, we have collected over 900 points from Charlotte Harbor up to St. Joe Sound. And this was planned to do about 25% of the field verification during the flights, but coronavirus happened. And most of our field ground truth has happened in the summer of 2020. We go out with a inexpensive Garmin Glow. It's 5-meter accuracy, an iPad, a GoPro that's attached to a pool pole, and we record about 30 seconds to a minute worth of benthic bottom. And on the boat, we also have the Survey 123 app for our field data collection, and we're recording presence, dominant and secondary seagrass species, attachment drift algae in their extent, bottom type, and any other notes. And normally we're completing that attribution of the points in the field while reviewing the imagery, the GoPro video on the computer. Thanks, Chris.
Yep, you bet. Yeah, so it's a pretty involved process, but it's not the only field work we do. So the QC spot checks are largely led by the district. So our staff, myself included, will go out and we will check areas where we have questions or we just want to look and see what is out there based on what the maps are showing us. Typically, the spot checks occur later in the process. So really, we hit it in earnest starting in January of this year. And as I said, for Springs Coast, we're still doing spot checks based on the preliminary results from the maps. So this is really an opportunity to get out in the field. We've worked very closely with our partners on these spot checks. So for example, Sarasota County was really helpful in pointing us in the direction of certain places where they noticed some issues. So we'll go out with them. We've gone out with the Aquatic Preserve staff, with Tampa Bay Estuary Program staff, Sarasota Bay. So we've gone out a lot with various partners to do these individual spot checks. But this is really a fine tuning of the map. So when we're out there doing these spot checks, this is really the very last stage of the project. I will also add here that we use the same Survey 123 app as the PIs do for ground truth, and it's the same app that we use for the independent accuracy assessment. So we're all collecting very similar, if not the same data, and then that data are used to help make a better map product.
Those are separate.
They're separate, yes.
The same.
They're separate but the same. And I'll talk about the independent accuracy assessment here in a minute. The other thing of note is that we try to log every point using underwater video. So we have a GoPro camera that's attached either to a sled or to a pole, and we can characterize the bottom based on underwater video. So to what Nate was talking about with the independent accuracy assessment, this is, and by definition, by the name, it is independent. In other words, this accuracy assessment is completely separate from the photo interpreter's work. And we do that on purpose in order to have an independent accuracy assessment that is used to accept the final map product. So Wood is leading this effort, and Kevin Shelton is the lead at Wood that's been doing most of the accuracy assessment. And I, as the program lead, work with Kevin and with Wood on this, but do not share any of this information to the PIs. And again, that's to make sure that we're not biasing the map by using these assessment points. We have about 1,200, a little over 1,200 sample locations that we've incorporated throughout the mapping area. We use a random stratified design. And as I said earlier, they use the same app, but the data are not shared with the PIs, at least during the map production. And so the last segment that I want to get into before we go into the results is the photo interpretation piece. And so we want to stress that when you look at the results, you got to remember that they're based on photographic signatures and the field verification that we just talked about. We use a modified flux or land use land cover classification system, which we'll talk about in a minute before we go on to the results. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nate, who's going to talk a little bit about how the PIs do their magic.
Yeah, so for the photo interpretation of the seagrass, we're relying on our 7 elements of primary image classification, where we're looking at tone and color of seagrass and algae, the size, shape, and texture, and sometimes relate to their growth patterns, rhizomatic growth for concentric circles versus maybe an irregular pattern for algae, and as well as maybe some shadow. Some of the Clearwater species do get a little taller, and then site and association, kind of in that order. And this helps differentiate our seagrasses from algae, whether they're many assemblages from drift algae, the attached algae, and up in Springs Coast, sargassum. And we're looking to detect these temporal shifts, and we are utilizing historical imagery. We built a time series for the last 6 collections for Swift Mud for this 2020 effort. So we go back to 2008 imagery. And this is really helpful when we start seeing how certain meadows are having a successional change on. Next.
It's a little delayed.
Yeah. So Chris talked about our flux codes. We have a collection of about 10 or 12 flux codes, but we really just wanted to focus on these 3 for the SAV component. We have a continuous code, and I can't see my notes here, but I believe it's 25% to 100% seagrass. It can have some inclusions of bare sand. So when we think about long bar systems, those are going to be included in continuous. For Patchy, we have the classic Wolf Branch Creek example here, showing a real patchy distribution of seagrass, but Patchy also includes sparse seagrass from 10 to 25%. And then attached algae, here we have Clearwater prolifera, but we also have some other algae we're mapping that are attached. Right now, we're not mapping drift algae, but that's a potential consideration down the road.
Chris and Nate, just a couple minutes left on this section. We not too many questions or one question in the chat box right now. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, we just have a few more slides and then we'll break for question and answer.
So here's an example from 25% up to 100 of continuous seagrass. And if we go to the next slide.
Okay, Nate, can I just make a quick comment here? So one of the things, the reason why we wanted to show this slide for everybody is just to really bring home the point that, you know, when we talk about continuous seagrass, like he said, we're talking about the photographic signature and the percent cover based on that photographic signature. It does not really speak to, I'll say, the quality of the grass. So when you see these maps coming up and you see a bright green polygon and it says continuous, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to look like the image on the top right. It could look like any one of these images. So just keep that in mind, because, you know, there's a continuum of continuous seagrass that looks, you know, like the picture perfect one on the right to, you know, something like the one next to it on top left. So just keep that in mind.
Great. And this area down in Placida, it's one of those areas where these are continuous beds, but they might be at 25%. And we go to the next slide. We have 2 questions come in I can address for Patchy. Our minimum mapping unit for Patchy is a 1/4 acre. And there is a convention to capture isolated patches when they're not at that size. And there's also a convention to lump and group mini patches to define a larger area. So if there's associated with a single one, we're probably capturing it as continuous, and if it's a grouping, we're capturing it as patchy. And here are some examples of patchy seagrass we have found in our field verification. And this is the area just south of Thalassia, north of the Manatee River opening, where we've got a patch field. And lastly, we have attached algae, Clearwater prolifera. We'll be discussing some of that in Old Tampa Bay, Ceratoloides, and Fastigiata down in Charlotte Harbor. And this is an area off the Interbay Peninsula just east of McDill. Next. To standardize Springs Coast and Sun Coast, that's a good question. Is it analogous with sparse and dense? Somewhat, and we are crosswalking that with the Sun Coast and the Springs Coast. So the Springs Coast in the past has been mapped with both dense and continuous, and now it's getting just a continuous mapping. But we'll focus just on the Sun Coast here. And for Sun Coast, we've added a composite colonized algae. It's really an area that lacks seagrass, has maybe less than 10% algae, but has a somewhat composite bottom with sponges or gorgonia. And some of these areas on the next slide are just south of the Skyway or just north as well. And these are some signatures that could be confused if someone's looking for seagrass and they're asking what this item is. So we're actually mapping some of these in the deeper area, even though they haven't been.
All right, well, that puts us at the end here. I did see some questions. So Gary, if there's time, I'm happy to field some of those questions.
Thank you, Chris. I think y'all have been answering them as we're going along on the fly, so that's good. You talked about the minimum mapping unit, the differentiation between the continuous and patchy. The other thing is a question just regarding the presentation. I know you're concerned about this being provisional data. Are you going to be able to make this presentation available? We are recording it today, so that will be available later this afternoon or tomorrow, or Monday at some point.
Yes, this will be made available. Anybody can have it. Just I would ask that if you use any of the map imagery, just to keep the disclaimer on it that this is provisional data, just at least until mid-May when we release the final. So I saw there are a couple other questions, Gary. I can't see. Oh, he's got questions up here. Okay.
So for our protocol for the Gopro, we navigate exactly to a point. So we have a float plan where we have a navigation to point, and the survey 123 captures the exact point. So there's 2 points. Sometimes we might have some drift from current, but we're really not seeing anything more than maybe 30 feet off the point. We're targeting areas that we have questions of. As far as the GoPro, we're taking a point number and immediately putting the GoPro into the water. We typically try to get 3 looks, so left, forward, and right side of our boat, and then we're off. We have about a 6 to 10 minute per point collection, including drive time. So when we're doing 50 miles in Charlotte Harbor, we do hit 50 to 60 points in a day, a full 8-hour day on the water.
Okay, we've got time for probably one last question on the Melinda Brown's asking about data on tidal flats, oysters, and hard bottom.
Yes, tidal flats and oysters are in our convention. We're just focusing on seagrass. Hard bottom, more so up in Springs Coast. For attached algae, it's been mapped not as extensively as it can be mapped. We are adding it in shallower areas. What we're trying to avoid is when algae is beyond the growth area for seagrass, we're trying not to capture it. So some of the past line work, especially on that Interbay Peninsula, we're not going into the deep edge because we're trying to keep this a seagrass focused map.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of points to that as well, that what you're going to see in the next several vignettes are maps that are going to show you the patchy, continuous, and detached algae only. We wanted to focus on that because the real story this cycle is the reduction in grass across the entire region. So understand when you see these maps, there are other conventions, there are other layers that we're just not showing you because we'll be here all day if we do that. And I also want to just remind everybody, this is not the last time you're going to see these data. This is not the last time you're going to see Nate and I. So if you have any questions, if there are other questions concerning some of the non-seagrass layers that we create, Absolutely, let's talk about it. But just for the purpose of today, we're going to show you the seagrass that is classified as patchy and continuous and the attached algae. So just keep that in mind as we go through. The other thing I just want to point out is something that Nate said about the spatial extent of our maps. So attached algae is a good example of that. We know Clearwater proliferans grows in fairly deep water, but this is not an attached algae map. It's a seagrass map. So we really limit the extent that we map to what I would consider what Nate said, the deep edge or the theoretical maximum based on the light requirements of seagrass and the light field in these estuaries. We don't, we're not mapping in the shipping channel, for example. So we understand there's other stuff in there. There is hard bottom habitat that's in deeper water, but we don't map it. In the Springs Coast we do, because that hard bottom habitat is in shallow water and it's mixed with seagrass. So you have this mosaic of habitat types there. Are we good to go on to the next one, Gary, or do we have time?
I think that's good, Chris. We need to move it along.
All right.
The one reminder I will request I'll put out there right now is, we definitely recognize that these results will gin up a lot of questions for everybody. We're going to try to focus for this first through the interior question answer on these results and not looking so much at the reasons behind those results. Those are a much larger question that I don't think we'll be able to answer today. We'll definitely record them in the chat, and we'll need to have some longer conversations on that as well. So thank you, Chris. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and switch to the results. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of show you the high-level overall results by estuary, and then we're going to go through each of these individually. So we're going to break this down by bay segment, by estuarine segment. But this is the high-level change that we've seen by estuary between 18 and 20, and you can see that all these estuaries have experienced a loss, although Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound really has seen only minor changes. And again, we'll break this down by individual estuary. For the sake of time, we're going to lump Clearwater and St. Joe Sound together with Tampa Bay. So we'll go through Clearwater, then we'll go through Tampa Bay, and then we'll stop for questions specific to those two systems. General trend, of course, is that it looks like we're increasing in the negative change as we go further south, -2% at Clearwater, St. Joseph Sound, down to 23% in Charlotte Harbor. So let's start with Clearwater Harbor, St. Joe Sound. What you're looking at over here on the left is the 2018 map. And again, I'll just remind you, we're only looking at 9113, which is patchy, 9116, which is continuous, and 9121, which is attached algae. So when you think of attached algae, you think of that classic Clearwater proliferans type of signature. Not a whole lot of change between 18 to 20 in this part of our mapping area. The largest decline was in the southern part of the Clearwater Harbor segment at about 9%. That translates to about a 72-acre loss. Really little to no change in St. Joe Sound. A 1% change in my mind is really more noise than anything else. So, a loss of 80 acres, that to me is essentially no change. Clearwater North, 5%, that's minor, but again, anytime you get below 5%, you're really talking about almost in the noise level of the map. So overall, a 2% change, not much, minor. But what I will leave you guys with this graph on the bottom right is if you look at the trends from 06, and we stop at 06 because this area was not mapped prior to 06. So Tampa Bay South, we have data that goes back to 88, in some cases 1982. But for Clearwater Harbor, St. Joe Sound, we started mapping that in 06, so we don't have data prior to that. But you can see that starting in 16, there has been a bit of a downward trend. So that's something that we need to keep a close eye on even in this area, although the decline between 18 to 20 was relatively small. So this is what the 20 map looks like. I know there's a time lag, so I'll wait for it to switch over. So you can see going from 18 to 20, not a whole lot of change. And then this map here on the left indicates the loss. So those red polygons are where we lost seagrass between 18 and 20. So it's scattered about. There's some areas that we might want to look a little bit closer at, but overall, not really a whole lot of change in this region, which is good news. Now, as we go over to Tampa Bay, the news is a little different. We mapped about a 13% drop in seagrass in Tampa Bay. That's about almost 5,500 acres of seagrass. The map on the left shows you what it looked like in 2018. Now, pay really close attention to Old Tampa Bay and Hillsborough Bay. As we move to 2020, what you're going to see is those green polygons turn to that bluish green color. So that's a shift from seagrass to attached algae. So remember those pictures of Caulerpa proliferans, that's what this area now looks like. And so you can see that across Feather Sound, there's been a shift from grass to Caulerpa. And Old Tampa Bay really did experience the greatest loss, both in terms of acreage, perhaps not in terms of percent change. Hillsborough Bay saw a 36% drop, but that's only about 525 acres. And while that's significant for Hillsborough Bay, Bay-wide, that's a relatively small number by comparison to Old Tampa Bay, where we've lost almost 3,200 acres of seagrass, or 30%. Compared to the 2018 maps. And the graph on the bottom shows you the time series from 1982 to the 2020 maps. And so you can see that our acreage totals are back down to where we were around 2010 to 2012 timeframe. And this is what it looks like in terms of the change. So again, those red polygons represent the areas where we lost grass. I want to focus on Old Tampa Bay specifically, because I think this is an interesting phenomenon that, while it has happened in other bay segments, it seems to be at this magnitude unique to Old Tampa Bay. In other words, what we've seen here is that shift from grass to algae. And so if you just look at the grass totals for Old Tampa Bay, what you see is that you lost 3,200 acres of grass and gained almost 3,000 acres of attached algae. So it's almost a one-for-one swap. Where you lost grass, it was replaced largely by this Caulerpa proliferans. And Nate, I'll let you talk us through this. So this is a slide showing you the imagery. This is part of Feather Sound, known as the Hump. So that big area that has gone from grass to Caulerpa. And Nate's going to just kind of walk us through the signatures here as through time.
Yeah, so starting at 2008 timeframe, we've got kind of light brown underlying patch system here with probably haliduli back then. I don't have the field data. And some of the darker signatures are drift algae. And then by 2010, what we see is the drift algae really becomes entrained inside of those patches, and in 2014 it's expanded beyond the patches. Even though the patch structure is still there, without seeing some of the field data, I would assume the seagrass percentage is dropping year to year. And in 2016 we had barely any remnants of those circular rhizominic growth patterns of haliduli. And by 2018, this is now also being invaded by Caulerpa. So there's Caulerpa and the red and green algae, drift algae up here. And in 2020, we put 25 field points up here and 1,700 acres of Caulerpa.
And what I want to also reiterate here is that in 18, this area was mapped as grass. And just because it's grass, it's not an either or. So it does not imply that there wasn't Caulerpa out there in 2018. It just means that there was more grass, or at least there was a percent of grass that met the threshold to be mapped as either patchy or continuous. One thing that I also want to do is I want to really highlight the importance of field data, and specifically the Transect data that Tampa Bay Estuary Program hosts is so critical to helping us get a better idea of what's happening in these areas. So those images are really important because we can start to look at successional patterns. If those of you who were at the macroalgae workshop a couple weeks ago, we talked about using imagery to kind of infer these successional changes. In other words, seagrass to macroalgae to, perhaps sand. There's all sorts of successional patterns that we can see. But what's really important with these transects is we can look at these transects and we can get a closer look at what may be going on. So when I first saw this, I went to the transects, and I got to give props to Marcus for this really cool dashboard. If you haven't seen it or visited it, definitely go to it. The link's right there. It's really a great resource. So that red line that you see is the transect, one of the longest transects we have in Tampa Bay, that is monitored on an annual basis, I believe. And so what you see on that graphic below is pulled right off the dashboard that Marcus created. And what it's showing you is those annual abundance based on that Brown-Blanc score of the transect. And so what's really neat about this is you can see the transition from grass in 2017 to almost entirely caulerpa by 2020. And I also want to just make it clear that these transects were collected at a different time of the year than when we flew. So the little airplane you see with the line, that's the approximate time when we fly. So we fly November to February, and the transect data are collected in the late summertime. So there's an offset, but you can see that with the transect data, it's picking up, or we're picking up, the same change that they're seeing in the transect. So it's really neat to combine these two resources to get a more complete picture of what's happening. And this, of course, is just one example. So what we're going to do now is just kind of wrap it up. Some of the overarching summaries for Tampa Bay, Clearwater Harbor. Again, we saw minor losses in the harbor and in St. Joseph Sound. Essentially, St. Joseph Sound is unchanged. We did see, a large loss this time in Tampa Bay. Most of that loss was really focused on Old Tampa Bay, where we saw about a 3,200 acre loss. The good news in Tampa Bay is that we continue to see very minor changes in the lower segments, Boca Ciega Bay with a 4% loss, Thalassia Bay with a 5% loss, minor. Again, you're approaching the noise level of the maps, and then lower Tampa Bay essentially is unchanged. So with that, I don't know how we're doing on time, Gary, but we're at the QA period for Tampa Bay, Clearwater Harbor, St. Joe Sound.
We're in good shape right now, Chris. We'll start with a question from Jessica Binza. There's such and I think she was talking about the Clearwater Sound. There was a jump from 06 to 08. Was there a change in methodology between those years?
Oh, in Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound, I do not believe that's a methodological change. If you guys remember, in 05, we had a pretty bad, albeit short-lived, red tide event. And I think that might be the recovery from that red tide. Unfortunately, we don't have 04 data. So I don't have a before, but that's my speculation, and that's all it is, a speculation. But I believe that you're seeing that increase due to the recovery from that red tide event. Also, I think 06 was a very dry year as well, so the water was probably a lot clearer going into 08 as opposed to 06.
Okay. And then there's again from Jessica, there's another question about implementation of projects of the Howard Franklin Bridge. Again, we'll see if we've got time at the end for this sort of discussion, because we've still got a lot of ground to cover, but this is definitely something that we are thinking about long term, and have been working on several angles. And Sheila did put the link to the Transect the Transect dashboard in the chat. Real quick, reaching back, since we're doing pretty good on time right now. Is the Survey 123 application available to share, or is that?
Yeah, it's an Excel, and you'll load it up with the Survey 123 app from Esri. I can send that to Jenny and anyone else that would like it.
Yeah, I would like to maybe in a future meeting discuss standardization for field work. I know there's a lot of groups doing so much good work out there, and I I think, Betty Stahler's been working really, really well with her volunteers, her Eyes on Seagrass, which I believe is expanding into Sarasota County or into Sarasota Bay. So this might be a good opportunity to introduce kind of a standardized, and I'm not suggesting that ours is the end all, but it may be a good starting point to look at. Anybody can upload or can, add the Survey 123 app on their phone. It's free. So if you have volunteers, it should be fairly easy to get them the app on their phone or their tablet, and might be a good way to standardize the data. I got to tell you, this is the first year that I have worked with Survey 123 on an operational level of this scale, and it's been great. I mean, we go out when we do our spot checks and we input the data, and it goes directly to Nate's shop. There's no, translating field sheets to Excel spreadsheets or having to go back to the office and upload. It just happens like that. And so it's been really a great tool. One area of improvement I'm hoping we can get to is linking the Gopro imagery on the fly with the Survey 123 data. If we can figure out a way to do that, that would be awesome, because we still do have to do that the old-fashioned way, where you go back and you try to figure out, okay, what video went with what point, which can be a little bit time-consuming.
And Ed's agreeing that it'd be a good idea for the working group to work on to help coordinate standardized field surveys.
Yes, agreed. What else we got, Gary?
That's it for now.
Okay.
So,
all right, awesome. So I guess we're doing good on time still. So without further ado, oh wait, something just came up. Perhaps we need to spend more time on the.
That came up in our macroalgae workshop.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and we did talk about that in our breakout group too. We were in the Tampa Bay breakout group, and that was definitely something that came out of that. So I think we're, just reinforcing the need to better understand the ecological implications of Caulerpa versus seagrass. So that's a great point. All right, so let's move on to Sarasota Bay. Similar story in terms of the loss of seagrass. These maps are going to look very, very familiar to you, hopefully by now. We start with the 2018, we'll scroll into the 2020, and then we'll look at the change. So this is what the bay looked like in 2018. 2020, as you can see from the table, this upper Sarasota Bay segment, which is the portion in Manatee County, is the segment that lost the bulk of the grass between 18 and 20, about 1,700 acres, or a 22% change between those two mapping cycles. So that's really, the part that stands out. But there's another story here that's really important, and that's in Roberts Little, Sarasota Bay, and Blackburn Bay. And so in those systems, we didn't really see much of a change. In fact, Blackburn Bay reported an increase in grass. Now, granted, it's only 13 acres, and the whole bay is only about 300 acres of seagrass. But for Blackburn Bay, that's significant. And just the fact that we've seen an increase, or at worst, no real change. Little Sarasota Bay, no change really. I mean, 0.2% is noise. And even Roberts Bay, with a -4%, a 15-acre drop, that's still, I would say, minor at best. So, you have two stories in Sarasota Bay. You have a huge loss in Sarasota Bay proper that seems to be focused around Longbar Point, but then you also have sort of a stabilization, or maybe even a slight increase in the southern estuaries. So if you look at this change map again, what stands out is the fact that most of that loss is centered around Longbar Point, below and above it. And all totaled, we've lost about 2,000 acres in Sarasota Bay, and that puts us back around the 2006 to 2008 timeframe. Still more than we have had historically in the past, but definitely lower than what we saw last year and even the year before. So again, pay attention to this trend, and I call it a trend with quotation marks. But you look at 16 to 20, you've got back-to-back losses. Again, something to keep in mind. But again, the good news here, perhaps, is that Blackburn, Little Sarasota, and Roberts Bay may have bottomed out. We're going to take a little bit closer look at that. But before we do that, I wanted to really focus on that upper Sarasota Bay segment. And so the graph on the bottom right just shows you the seagrass, the mapped seagrass in upper Sarasota Bay Manatee for 2010 to 2020. And then Nate's going to talk us through some of the imagery that you see here.
Yeah, this is just west of the Long Bar Point at the end of the old ICW. And in 2010, we see algae already on this, all 4 of these meadows, if we use that as a breakout. And it's a darker signature. There's seagrass there. In 2014, it's also, not only is it entrained in the seagrass meadow, it's also moved beyond the meadow. And in 2016, you almost see some hollowing out of seagrass. And what we're considering is mapping the drift algae for future maps, because you can have seagrass and drift algae and be a seagrass polygon. In 2018, still the drift algae is there, but by 2020, it is a sandy bottom. There is no vegetation, no seagrass nor drift algae.
And this was an area where we went out with the estuary program with Dave Tomasco, and we snorkeled around. Well, actually, he snorkeled around. It was a really cold, rainy day, so he took one for the team on that one. But we really canvassed this area because we wanted to confirm that this was something that was real and wasn't an artifact of the photography. And there's no grass out there, so at least there wasn't as of a few months ago. And again, I just want to reiterate that the image that you're looking at, that 2020, was taken in December, January timeframe of last year. So that's at this point, a dated imagery, but we went out a few months ago and confirmed that, most of that area still looks that way. Anything else on this before we move on?
Just from what we experienced in the field, the entrainment of these drift algae, and they're green, red, and browns, they're really structured inside the seagrass. So, and the seagrass sometimes can look sad. It's 12 inches or 14, 16 inches. So you actually get 2 or 3 stories of drift algae. The biomass, could probably be a magnitude difference. And so for this area, we see similar analogs just north of New Pass that look like the 2018 imagery here. And there's a potential that it could look like the 2020 imagery in 2022.
Yeah, one of the things that we're looking into by developing these, and Nate did a really good job of putting these time series together, and we can go back even further than 2010. That's just where we kind of had to cut it off somewhere. But as we learn about how these signatures change over time and what that means, from an ecological standpoint, there's the potential that we could start to look at forecasting areas that we might have concerns. So like Nate had said, if you see an area where you're seeing an expansion of algae, and this is pretty ubiquitous in this mapping cycle, where if you toggle between the 18 and the 20s, you will see an expansion, perhaps not enough to affect the classification of that seagrass polygon, but you will see that some of these algae have expanded. And so by looking at the past, we can perhaps start to forecast the future and identify hotspots, if you will, that we might want to go and apply some resources to take a closer look in anticipation of potential loss. And I'll flip that on the other side too, that it's also good to look at potential recovery. So some areas, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, we think might be on the verge of some kind of recovery. It's way too early to say, but there are some areas that look like maybe they've bottomed out. And I'm going to go to the next slide and show you one of those areas. So this is, again, those southern estuaries in the Sarasota Bay area. So Roberts Bay, Little Sarasota Bay, and Blackburn Bay. The plots on the right are showing you the total acreage over time. And what we've seen really in especially Little Sarasota and Blackburn Bay is perhaps, and again, we're being speculative, but perhaps a bottoming out of loss. So we lost a lot of seagrass in these small estuaries between 16 and 18, but the story is different from 18 to 20. So we don't want to lose sight of potential recovery areas as well as areas that are in danger of loss. And Nate, if you did you want to add anything to those images on the left?
This is an area where just east and west of the channel, it's a little deeper, and we do have drift algae and caulerpa here, where in 2020 and 2018, it's not as abundant, but in 2010, we can see seagrass areas were there, and in 2016, maybe the introduction of drift algae.
All right, so for Sarasota Bay, these are just some of the high-level summary points. Unfortunately, we did see a significant loss, about 2,300 acres. But there may be some good news here as well in the sense that Roberts, Little Sarasota, and Blackburn Bay didn't experience the same magnitude of loss that we saw in Sarasota Bay proper. And so with that, I think we're at the Q&A break. How are we doing on time, Gary?
We're in good. We're in good shape right now. Thanks, Chris.
Great. So I saw there was some questions. I did want to just jump real quick back to something. Maya Burke had a comment in there about Manatee River. We just, for time's sake, we didn't cover all the base segments. Manatee River did show a loss of about 21% or 150 acres. So, again, we focused on Old Tampa Bay, but that's not at all, the only area that we're looking at. I'll just, again, remind everybody, this isn't the last time we're going to see these data, or myself and Nate. So, we're happy to either talk offline or to do it in a subsequent meeting. We can focus on each of these estuaries deeper. So what do we have? Let's see.
Dave is asking about the macroalgae trends within the channels, wondering if that are not showing up in previous years.
Yeah, Chris, if we can, first off, great presentation. What you're talking about makes an awful lot of sense. It matches up with what we've talked about with the estuary program. The only question I have, it's not really a concern, but the question I have is we don't have good data on macroalgae abundance in the northern part. Sorry about that. But I'm not quite convinced about the macroalgae trend in the upper part of the bay, and for this reason. We've got those channels right now that are about 2 feet deeper than the surrounding area, and right now they collect macroalgae. And if you look at some of the earlier photography, they don't have anything, and that's basically because they're a little bit too deep for seagrasses to grow. There's nothing wrong with the bottom there, but it was beyond the light limit. So right now, I think a stronger explanation of what happened is phytoplankton rather than macroalgae. 2 very strong red tides. I don't mean to suggest that's the only thing that happened, but I'm not really convinced that there's enough information from the photography to suggest we've had an accumulating abundance of macroalgae over time. I'm not saying it didn't, but those kind of features, the old ICW, the footprint of the Longboat Key pipeline, they right now accumulate macroalgae, and it doesn't really show up in the earlier photography. So I'm not quite sure that we actually do have strong evidence of macroalgae accumulating over the last 10 years. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm not sure that the data really show that strongly.
Yeah, and Dave, that's yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're not implying that that these are actually definitive trends. We're saying that we can use this imagery as a tool, but you underscore a couple things. Number one, the importance of field data is huge. To be able to look at these things from the air is great because we look at it at a synoptic scale, but you've got to have that data. And so, like Nate had mentioned earlier, we haven't looked back at a lot of the field data that was collected in the past. So it's a story that's still being told. So we're not sure, just like you said, if this is really a causative factor, but it's just something that we've observed. The other thing too that I think you underscore is the importance of taking these these maps segment by segment. What's driving the loss in Sarasota Bay perhaps is not what's driving the loss in Charlotte Harbor or Tampa Bay, or maybe it is, but it really is important that we take a more surgical approach rather than just getting too hung up on the total number for Sarasota Bay, for example. Let's break it down. And so like we showed, you know, maybe a different story in Little Sarasota Bay and Blackburn Bay as opposed to Sarasota Bay.
And we appreciate that level of detail. I think you're doing a great job, and we look forward to working with you on developing a protocol for hopefully monitoring what we need to do to recover the northern part of the bay.
Yep.
The other comment
yes.
right now in there is from Chris Kaufman regarding epiphytes, that they can create similar entrenched signatures if they're significantly present in the system.
Yeah.
That's correct. Maybe we're over generalizing macroalgae, but microalgae, epiphytes all start creating that darker brown-black signature, which is also sometimes indicative of really healthy Serengodium or Thalassia beds. And so not only is tone and color, but also that shape. So when we can see the circular patterns of rhizomatic growth at edges of the meadows, we know seagrass is at least present. And when we get beyond it and it's that irregular shape, it's not necessarily attached or associated with the seagrass. And there are a couple examples in that long bar system. So there's some dynamic properties there, and just trying to look at that time series backwards to help inform how to draw the map this year.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that we annotate in the Survey 123 app is epiphyte load. So it's really important. And with the video, it adds that extra layer of validation, so that if there are areas that, you know, either we are aware of or the larger seagrass community is aware of, we can go back and you know, verify that what we saw was more epiphytic than, you know, attached or drift. So that's a really good point. Let's see, what else do we have?
That's it for now, Chris. I think we can move on to coastal Heartland.
Okay. All right. So moving south on our tour, we're going to pick up now with Lemon Bay. And so Lemon Bay had about a 12% change, or a 347 mapped acre reduction. The map on the left, again, is 2018. If I shift to 20, you're not going to see a whole lot of difference. So that's important to note, because if we go to the change map, those red polygons are kind of spread throughout. And so that's interesting, because it's a different pattern from what we saw between 16 and 18. I do want to point out, though, that Lions Bay, Don and Roberts Bay, way up here in this corner, are lumped in with Lemon Bay. Maybe they shouldn't be, but at this point, it is part of the Lemon Bay segment. And so we did see quite a bit of loss there. I think in future presentations, I'm going to take that area and just report on that, because we did see quite a bit of loss between 18 to 20. And if you look at the 18 map, you know, you can see, if you squint really hard, you'll see some of those green polygons there. And then in 20, most of that disappeared. So very small acreage overall, but significant for that system. One of the things that is really interesting about the loss in Lemon Bay is that if we compare it to the loss from 16 to 18, so this was one of the estuaries in the 18 map that did show a significant decrease, about 11% total loss of seagrass in Lemon Bay in 2018. But if you look at where that loss occurred, it was really focused on that very upper portion of Lemon Bay. That's different from what we're seeing in 18 to 20. In 18 to 20, it's kind of scattered about throughout the system, and up in Don and Roberts Bay and Lions Bay as well. What's interesting about that is it corroborates with a lot of reports that we've been getting, working with Rennie at Sarasota County and John Ryan, who have been doing a really great job of keying us in on areas where we have large expanses of not only drift algae, but also some areas of attached algae as well. So we went out with the county. We've been out several times actually in Lemon Bay to investigate this, and just to confirm that pattern of loss seems to be scattered throughout the estuary as opposed to focused in one area like it was in 16 to 18. And then when we go down to Charlotte Harbor, this is where perhaps, again, try not to be too speculative, but I think in general, we all agree that the impacts of red tide were fairly severe in parts of Charlotte Harbor, especially along the eastern wall. And that, I think, is reflected in the numbers that you see here. So the eastern wall of Charlotte Harbor lost the bulk of the grass in this system. About 1,800 acres of grass was lost between 18 and 20, which represents about a 53% change. So that's really significant change, and we're gonna delve into that here a little bit deeper in the next several slides. But overall, all the bay segments that we have in the harbor system that we map experienced reductions in seagrass, including Myakka River, Peace River. And what that really ends up doing is it really ends up with a total for 2020 of about 15,000 acres. And so that's below any other total that we've had since we started mapping in 1988. And again, if you look at, this is the 2018 map, you can see where the bulk of the loss occurred. If we switch over to the loss map showing you those red areas where we've reported a mapped loss from 18 to 20, a large part of that is focused on the east wall. That's not to say that we haven't seen significant losses elsewhere. The western wall also saw quite a bit of loss, 22%, which is about 400 acres. And most of that loss was a retreat or a loss along the deep edge. So that's that red line essentially represents the deep edge. So we had that loss, and the grasses basically are growing in shallower water. The loss is sort of scattered about in Turtle Bay, Bull Bay, Placida, and in the southern Charlotte Harbor. We saw less loss along what we call the southern portion of the east wall, but there's still significant loss that we saw there as well. But I want to focus on the east wall of Charlotte Harbor here for a little bit, because we did see such a dramatic reduction. And this is the area, for those of you who are familiar with this part of the world, has experienced a proliferation of we'll call it drift algae, but it really isn't drifting. It's been persistent now for going on 2 years almost. And so this area is unique in the sense that not only is it so dominated by that filamentous algae, but it's different from much of the other systems that we've looked at. So Tampa Bay, there's drift algae, but it's mostly like that Gracilaria type of drift. There's also a lot of Clerpa, attached algae in that system. The same with Sarasota Bay and Lemon Bay, where most of the drift algae is more of that Gracilaria type of drift algae. When you get down further south, it starts to transition into this filamentous algae, which from what I understand is a species of Clerpa. It's an interesting species because it can drift around, it can form these long filaments, but it can also attach itself to the ground. So it is a real challenge for us when we're trying to map it, because do you call it attached, do you call it drift, or do you call it something else? And so I'll turn it over to Nate to talk about this figure here.
And we decided to map it for this because it was an attached algae. And we have in the next 3 slide series, we'll focus on northern east wall near Alligator Creek, and then a middle section, and then a southern section. And Kristen's efforts are for the field are in the yellow triangles, and our efforts are in the green circles. In that southern middle green circle, just east of the Longshore Bar system, there's this almost neon green signature, and that's the Clerpa, and it's almost it's synonymous with the linear system of the long bar. There's a linear patch of Clerpa here from north to south.
Well, I just want to add too, so these points represent field points that I forget, the triangles were ours. So those are representative of points that I was out with the Aquatic Preserve on one day, with Fish and with Fish and Wildlife with Dave Blewett on the other day. So, but I just want to make sure that I just point out that these are not the only points that we have. So we do have the independent accuracy assessment points, which we're not showing today, and additional data too that we were given by the Aquatic Preserve, by Mindy's staff as well. So, just understand that these are not the only points that we have in these systems, but these are points that are here to characterize what Nate's talking about. So now we're moving down the east wall, and you can see the arrow where it's pointing.
Yeah, similar story. Like Haliduli, maybe some retreat on the deep edge, most western extent coming up to the Longbar system. Behind it, some Thalassia transitioning to the Clearwater, and then just east of some of those mangrove islands all the way to the shoreline proper is drift algae.
And I just want to reiterate here too that in 18 a lot of this area was mapped as grass. Doesn't mean that the algae wasn't present. Remember, we're looking at it from a percent cover and based on aerial signatures. So the algae, like Nate said, didn't just show up from nowhere between 18 and 20. It was there. And those of you who do workout in this area know very well that algae has been there for quite some time. But what happened in 2020 is it became the dominant signature. And so now we're mapping it either as a loss or as attached algae. And you can see on the map to the left, those darker polygons are representative of the attached. Again, not Caulerpa proliferans per se, but the attached version of this Caulerpa. And I can't remember the species name. Do you remember, Nate, what this one is called?
Fastigiata.
Is this Fastigiata? Okay, so that's what right now it has been identified. I think Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation and others have done some workups on this algae and have concluded that not all of it, but a majority of it is that Fastigiata species.
But here on the southern end, yeah, same scenario. The Longbar system, we've got somewhat of a retreat of Haliduli on the western edge with Thalassia maybe on either side of the Longbar proper, moving through to eventually a 0% seagrass. I believe for the last 3 points on the green transect here, it was all no seagrass presence at all. And since these 3 slides do show 2 different time series, the eastern image was probably our first collection in November, so it's a little darker, probably a little more biomass, and I believe the left side is the January collect, so we see a senescence of some of the biomass.
Yeah, that's an important reminder, is that sometimes, like we talked about it earlier, we will do reflights. And so this was either a reflight. I don't think it was. I think it just fell. The tides and the weather conditions were such that it wasn't until January when we were able to give the go for flight. But you can see the difference. And so even between November and January, there can be a difference. And one thing I'll just note as an aside, we have noticed in at least the 2020 cycle, but even just anecdotally since 2018, that November is really starting to look more like September than it is December from a water clarity perspective, and even just from a weather perspective. You're still seeing thunderstorm buildup. You're seeing cumulus clouds building up in November, much like you do in September. So one thing that we're discussing is possibly moving our flight window from November 1st to December 1st, because we had a tough time early on finding days when the clarity was good enough and that the weather condition and the atmospheric conditions were good enough. So maybe a function of changing climate, but we think that it might be better to maybe compress that flight window, which brings its own challenges because of the very strict requirements we have for flight. If you're essentially taking 30 days or 31 days off the calendar, that makes it a little bit more challenging. But that is an important point to note, that these images were taken at different times, and that's also taken into consideration, that what was there in November may be slightly different than what was there in January. So just to wrap up the high-level points for Lemon Bay and Charlotte Harbor, again, for Lemon Bay, we saw a second cycle of loss. We had 11% loss between 16 and 18, and now we have a 12% loss between 18 to 20, although the pattern of loss is different. There's still about 347 less mapped acres of seagrass habitat in Lemon Bay. We've seen now that in Charlotte Harbor, about 2,500 acres of loss reported between 18 to 20, which does represent the lowest coverage that we've seen since we started mapping that system in 1988. Other than that, really, I just wanted to leave you with a bit of a good news, maybe, that along the east wall, so we've been working very closely with the aquatic preserve staff, and Mindy has been great relaying reports from her staff. Dave Blewett's been awesome relaying reports from his staff as well, going out and collecting just observational data during their fish trawls. And it appears that at least there's some areas along the east wall where some of that algae may be dissipating. We have seen some signs that some of the seagrass are starting to grow back along some of the transects, but it's way too early to assign that as a recovery. But it is a bit of a bright spot in an otherwise bad news story. And just to go back to the point that Dave made, it's really important that we characterize not only potential future losses, but also potential future increases. So if this is an area where we might see recovery, and that might help with our hypothesis that the bulk of this loss was related to red tide. If we do see a recovery, assuming, knock on wood, we don't see another major red tide event in the next few years, that's very important that we characterize that and we collect the right data in order to help capture any potential recovery anywhere across this area. So with that, I think we're okay on time, and we can answer some questions, I think, Gary, right?
That is correct. There aren't any related to Coastal Heartland in the chat box right now. Feel free to put in your questions. We'll give a couple of minutes, and then we'll try to address some broader scale things.
Yeah, so Mindy put a really good comment in here about the macroalgae seeming to increase in mass and distribution during early winter months, but subsides in spring, summer. So yeah, and I can't stress enough that we need to look at these maps holistically together with all the other data and just the institutional knowledge that we have just here on this call, but in general. These maps, again, they're taken at a time when macroalgae tends to be greatest. So it doesn't mean that we are necessarily overestimating, but I think it provides us with a conservative estimate of what's out there. Conditions may improve in the summertime, but we don't capture that in our imagery. So it's really important, those folks like Mindy's group that goes out in the field and actually collects data and looks at these areas, that we really capture the full story. Do you manually draw polygons over the images? Good question. Kind of leads into one of the last slides that we have.
Yeah, we do manually draw this. For 2018, Aaron Brown was at Swiftmud, and we did a automatic digitizing for him using eCognition. So that's a potential item we'll do for the 2020 map. It's very interesting how that goes, because the computer draws all of our polygons, and we can go around and collect, so to speak, what's seagrass and what's not. So when we have a signal to noise ratio, for instance, where biomass for algae is larger than the seagrass component, some of that, the computer's going to see the algae. So there's still going to be some manual photo interpretation to do. It does cut down on our drawing. And I would say it's really a similar cost effort. However, we're generating, for maybe the landscape ecologist, we're generating 7 linear miles of edge, meadow edge, to 1 linear mile when considered to the digitizing effort.
Yeah.
There were
And
a
just,
couple.
oh, I'm sorry, I was just going to say, one of the points that we're going to bring up here in a minute is about semi-automated classification and kind of what our plans are moving forward with that.
Yeah, there were, I missed a couple of questions in the chat. John Ryan will, putting yours in the parking lot. We'll see if we can get to that in a moment. Paul Carlson asking about the benthic cover between seagrasses and mangroves along the Charlotte Harbor east wall.
Is he asking what is there?
I think so.
Yeah, so one of the things that we did this mapping cycle, which was really beneficial, was we went out, I went out with Dave Blewett, and I don't know if Dave's on the call, but he's got his magic mullet boat, and this thing can go into like 3 inches of water. It's incredible how shallow we can go. And some of the points you may have seen in those previous slides are way back up in the mangroves. So we were able to characterize what was there in some of those really back bay areas, and most of it was drift algae, was macroalgae. Some of it was that Clarpus fastigiata. A lot of it was that fastigiata, but it kind of was a mixture of that and some of the more kind of gracilaria type looking algae. And then there were fairly large areas where there wasn't anything. It was just more like mud flat.
Dave, do you want to ask your question?
Excuse me, it wasn't really a question, but like an observation of potential concern. Those losses on the outside edge of the eastern wall that have been documented, as well as the replacement with Caulerpa in the southern area. The losses on the outside edge of the offshore bar on the eastern wall in Charlotte Harbor that might hopefully not be, but might be kind of reminiscent of the kind of phenomena Rob and Lewis talked about years ago. That think if you've been on that eastern wall, there's like grass beds that come up to a shallow area where it's too shallow for grass, and then you created that used to have these beautiful grass beds from there to the shoreline. And those offshore bars were kind of like a wave break, if you would. And that wave break, when it deteriorated on the middle part and lower part of Tampa Bay, it preceded a loss of seagrass. So in other words, that to me is concerning, the potential, kind of degradation of that offshore bar on the eastern wall. I think that's an area of concern. If it follows the trajectory of Tampa Bay, it could lead to further declines just from a hydrodynamic forcing factor.
I think you're right, and I also think that's true for the west wall, where we've seen now really back to back. I hate using the word retreat, but loss along that deep edge. So it's definitely shallower now where we see the grass.
There's a question in there from Nicole Udavia. Would you like to ask that one, Nicole?
Sure. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, what's interesting about this too is I keep forgetting that this is only down to basically the Pirate Harbor area, but and I'm sure Mindy and Dave have seen too, the Matlacha area has a lot of losses, and it would just be interesting to see the estuary as a whole, all of these maps together. So I realize that you all have a district boundary that kind of crisscrosses this estuary, but it would be great in the future to see coordination so we could get the entire picture of the estuary and see what was going on everywhere simultaneously. I think that would be a really helpful thing in the future. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, and I had the opportunity to go out with Dave and Mindy into Bokeelia and Pine Island Sound, so I saw firsthand, the proliferation that drift algae that you're talking about. We do coordinate as much as we can with South Florida. They have just recently flown that area between Estero Bay and Caloosahatchee, so the southern portion of the Charlotte Harbor Estuary. I think they're probably in the process of doing they're doing the post-processing now. I don't know if anybody's on from South Florida, but we are, talking to them to see, how we can better coordinate those efforts so that we can get that common operating picture of the whole Charlotte Harbor Estuary.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Okay, we're running pretty good for time right now.
Okay. I have a few more, just a couple more wrap-up slides, Gary, if I have time.
That would be great, Chris.
Really, the last slide I wanted to really show folks is just the next step. So where we are in the process. So, the thing that is important to note is that, and I know Aaron and Chris Kaufman completely can relate to this, that seagrass mapping that we do at the district is not, there is really no end and beginning. It just rolls into the next cycle. So we are actually now getting geared up for the 22 cycle. At this point in time, the flight window will open this November, so November 1st, unless we decide to push it to December 1st. But we're working on getting that geared up. We do have a lessons learned that we put together for FY20, and so we'll be incorporating that and several other things. So a couple of the points below that FY20 22 bullet, we continue to see improvements in image quality. There are 6-inch pixel resolution imagery that we can acquire. So we may go to a 6-inch pixel resolution for 22, which is going to, make the imagery even that much more clear when you zoom in. Nate talked about the semi-automated mapping. We haven't forgotten about that. We still intend to transition to a semi-automated type of a system using eCognition or some other type of software. What I'll say with that is that I think we would like to have subsequent meetings in the near future to discuss some of the nuances of that semi-automated mapping. We have plans to run the semi-automated with the 2020 imagery and also with the 22. So what that's going to provide us with is a change analysis or a change map between 18 to 20 and 20 to 22 that we'll be able to use side by side with the manual photo interpretation. We chose not to go push semi-auto in 2020 because we knew that there were going to be some big changes reported, and we did not want to have to try to tease out change due to methodology and change due to what's really happening in the field. So we went ahead and left everything as manual, the way it was done in 18, so we could get a better comparison and also a better look back to the data from the period of record back to 88. But we do intend to switch at some point in time, but we're not going to make that decision on the fly. It's going to be a very measured and quantitative approach before we do it. But we do think that the future of aerial seagrass mapping does lie in that semi-automated process. The other thing that we want to talk about moving forward is
Chris,
really
can I ask a question?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
We had some sort of discussions when the transition from film to digital photography took place with the district. Is there any chance that any side-by-sides for the same years can be at least in maybe some pilot areas or in a subset of the areas throughout the district's flight to do these comparisons and make those assessments?
Yeah, so that's part of the transition process. So we did a side-by-side in 18. So we've got both semi-automated and manual together for 18. What we don't have yet is a change map using semi-automated together with manual. So that's why we want to go back and we're going to do the semi-automated for the 20 maps and then for the 22s as well. So we'll have 3 cycles of both manual and semi-auto side by side, and we'll have 2 cycles of change both for manual and semi-auto so that we can present those numbers. And hopefully what Nate and I are hoping is that we can come up with some Yeah, I hate to say conversion factor, but just
Rosetta Stone.
yeah, so that we can actually go back in time and look at the older historical data and get a feel for, okay, what would have the 1996 numbers looked like had we used semi-auto? That may be, you know, unicorns and rainbows, but we're going to try and see if we can do that. But at the very least, we will have at least three mapping cycles where we'll have both side by side together, so we can do that. And again, we're not doing this in a vacuum. We want to share this information with the seagrass community at large and talk about it before we make any decisions. And that leads me to the flux definitions and conventions. You know, every year we seem to fine tune the map without losing detail or without losing that continuity, which is really important. So we want to look at that. And Nate alluded to that with these areas where we have like fastigiata, which can be both drift and attached. So what do we call it? There's also areas like in Lemon Bay, for example, where we've got drift algae that have been persistent for quite some time. So at what point do you stop calling drift algae drift? So these are conversations that we're having internally, but we also want to have with the larger group. And the same thing too with the segmentation schemes. So some of the segmentation schemes that you've seen, they are not set in stone. Some of them were drawn for reasons that probably made sense years ago, but maybe don't now. So when we're looking at like Sarasota, for example, we have that Manatee County portion of Sarasota Bay that includes Palmasola Bay. Well, Palmasola Bay maybe should be its own, and it was at one time. Same thing with Lemon Bay. You've got Donna and Roberts Bay and Lions Bay way up there in the north. It's tiny, true, but maybe that should be its own segment, and we should look at that, you know, separately from Lemon Bay. So all these things that we're looking at getting ready for 22, I think there's a lot of lessons learned that we've come up with in the 20 maps. And we want to, you know, encourage this dialogue and collaboration with our partners, because like I said, we don't do this in a vacuum, and we can't do this alone. So I just want to finish up with, you know, a shout out. I know this is not an all-inclusive list, but I really do want to thank everybody, many of you who are on this call today, for all the hard work that you guys do out there and to help us make a better map product. And so with that, I know we've covered a lot today. So to reiterate, this is not the last time you're going to see Nate and I. This is not the last time you're going to see these slides and additional data. So there are plans for us to take this show to the technical advisory committees, to the environmental advisory committee of the district, and that's my contact info. So if anybody has any questions or anything that they want to talk about, please reach out and let's have that conversation. So Gary, I think we're right on time at 10:30. Do we have any last, do you have time for any last questions, or how are we looking?
Thank you so much, Chris and Nate. That was really good information, and yeah, spot on time. One thing, like we were saying, we were trying to stick to the data that's in front of us right now. It would be, but definitely remiss if we at some point don't address some of those management questions that were coming through. And something that Chris and I were talking about might be, you know, an opportunity to come back in a couple of months, either just convening as the working group, or have potentially a workshop at our Basis Association of NEP meeting in the fall, October. If you've got any interest one or the other way, please let us know. But we have 3 more really good presentations that'll help bring some different perspectives on multiple components for the seagrass ecosystem. I would suggest we take about an 8-minute break real quick, let you stretch your legs, check emails and all that fun stuff, and then we will get right back to it if you want to continue in the chat. Again, everything's being recorded. I have been taking notes from several partners, different questions that were not addressed specifically here. No worries, Jessica. But we'll definitely put out some follow-up information. Again, thank you, Chris and Nate, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes, 8 minutes, 10:40, we'll call it.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Chris and Nate. Excellent job.
Give it about 2 minutes more, folks. Sheila, are you ready to go?
Yeah. You want me to share my screen?
Sure.
Can you see me? Or my screen at least?
Yep, we can
Cool.
see the screen. Yeah, we're seeing the top and bottom bars too, just so you know.
This is how it looks in presenter mode or when you present on Google Slides.
Ah, okay.
So.
Okay, we're at the 10:40 mark. Welcome back. Hope you had a chance to take a 5-minute relaxation. Welcome back. Thank you for again for attending the Southwest Florida Working Group, Seagrass Working Group meeting. Our next presentation is by Sheila Scalero. She is the Public Outreach Specialist for the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, and she's going to talk about some of her master's thesis work. And congratulations to her completing that in the fall.
Cool. Thanks, Gary. Well, like Gary said, my name is Sheila Scalero. I'm with the Estuary Program. But today I just wanted to give a brief overview of some of the work that I completed before I was at the Estuary Program while I was still at FWRI. So I couldn't have done any of this work without the support and the help from the Seagrass Lab at FWC, including Paul Carlson, Lori Yarbrough, Allison Patronella, and Mike Poniatowski. So thank you all. As Gary said, this is part of my master's thesis, which I successfully defended in October. So thankful that that part of my life is over. So this is, like I said, just like a high-level overview of some of the findings from my thesis, and is supposed to act more as a teaser for publications to come. So just to reorient you all to where we are in the world, the Tampa Bay Estuary extends about 400 square miles and has a watershed of about 5 times the size. It receives fresh water from many creeks and streams, as well as 4 major rivers, including the Hillsborough, Manatee, Alafaya, and Little Manatee River. Tampa Bay is home to 3 active ports, which we all are very familiar with now. And there's a deep water channel connecting them to the Gulf of Mexico. So similar to other estuaries in the region, Tampa Bay is often broken up into 4 subregions that Chris was explaining earlier. So Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, Middle Tampa Bay, and then Lower Tampa Bay. In Tampa Bay, we have 5 main species of seagrass: Haliduli, Syringodium, Rupia, Thalassia, and even Halophila makes it into the mix. Thalassia is dominant in the lower regions of the bay and is the species of focus for this study. So as many of you know, Thalassia is considered a climax species and considered high value habitat. It produces an extensive network of underground rhizomes where they store carbohydrates. So this is typically the species we talk about, or we're referring to when we talk about seagrasses storing carbon. But because of that storage, they are often more resistant to periodic disturbances like hurricanes. Seagrasses are originally land plants that migrated back into the water column about 100 million years ago. And because of that, they retain a lot of the same characteristics that we see in land plants today. One of those characteristics is that they can reproduce sexually or asexually. Asexual reproduction is done in Thalassia through rhizome extension and results in clonal ramets, or essentially identical copies of the parent plant. This is typically considered the dominant form of reproduction in this area. Sexual reproduction is done through submerged flower production, and if it is successful, it results in high genetic diversity. So Thalassia is dioecious, meaning that it has separate male and female plants. Sexes are distinguishable visually if they're actively undergoing sexual reproduction. So this top photo shows a picture of a female. It's typically yellow to greenish in color. And then the bottom photo displays a male, typically white with purple to pink spots on them. Both are about the size of a quarter, so they're pretty easy to spot if you're like me and have your head deep in the seagrass beds. Males can produce up to 5 flowers in one season, while females typically only produce a solitary flower. It is suggested that plants reach sexual maturity at about 2 years of age, or after they produce about 20 to 25 leaves. So the productivity of the plants themselves can help to increase their maturity. Temperature, salinity, and photo period have all been proposed as potential cues for inducing sexual reproduction, but as of now, we haven't really come to a complete consensus yet. So just to set the mood a little bit, at sunset during summer-spring tides, the males undergo a synchronized pollen release. Pollination is done through a combination of biotic and abiotic mechanisms. So abiotic pollination is done through what we call hydrophily, which is simply pollen movement by water. This was considered the only form of pollination in Thalassia until about 2013. And distance of pollen movement is typically influenced by hydrodynamic features like currents and turbulence, as well as the meadow structure like blade height and seagrass density. Biotic pollination is done through what's called zoobenthophyly, which is the transport of pollen to female flowers by small marine invertebrates. And if you haven't seen a video of the zoobenthophyly, I highly recommend watching it. It's pretty amazing. I'll drop a link to the YouTube video after this presentation if you're interested. So if fertilization is successful, seeds begin to develop inside a fruit capsule. A fruit capsule is pictured here in the bottom photo, and fruits typically hold about 1 to 6 seedlings. When the seedlings are mature, the fruit dehisces or pops open and little seedlings are released. Seedlings are negatively buoyant, so they typically roll around the bottom of the sediment until they find a nice patch to root in. They are viviparous, meaning that they have already germinated while still inside the fruit. Therefore, they root much faster, typically in only about 3 days. So although it is very complicated and extremely energetically expensive, sexual reproduction results in increased genetic diversity, which is an indicator of species health and a requirement for long-term habitat resilience. So there were extensive studies done on Thalassia sexual reproduction in the 1970s and the 1980s. However, there was a lack of standardization between these different sampling procedures. Additionally, they were conducted during periods of pretty poor water quality and before seagrass restoration had really taken hold in Tampa Bay. As we move forward and we begin to feel the full effects of climate change and sea level rise, we'll become more dependent on seagrass meadows to replace some of our other bay, submerged bay habitats. Therefore, it is critical that we have an understanding of the health of these ecosystems. So this demands a modern look at seagrass sexual reproductive effort and success, because ultimately sexual reproduction is what drives genetic diversity and long-term habitat resilience. So for my study, I wanted to answer two main questions. The first, is there spatial variability of reproductive effort and success in Tampa Bay? And then second, does the location of the short shoot or the plant itself within a bed affect the reproductive effort? So the goal from the study is that it will provide modern information about reproductive effort and success of a high value and a critically important species in Tampa Bay. Since sexual reproduction increases genetic diversity, this information will provide insights into species health and resilience. And then finally, results will provide guidance on priority locations for increased management efforts moving forward. So for this study, I surveyed 10 sentinel locations located in 3 of the Bay's subregions. Gandy Flat and Weeden Island are in Old Tampa Bay. Coquina Key and Cockroach Bay sites are located in Middle Tampa Bay. And then Joe Bay and Egmont Key sites are located in Lower Tampa Bay. For reference, Cockroach Bay sites are adjacent to the Little Manatee River. These sites were chosen based on historically surveyed sites back in the 1970s and the 1980s. So all of the sites were surveyed every 4 weeks from May to July in 2017. At each site, we put down 40 quarter-meter squared quadrats, and they were randomly placed in Thalassia dominated sections of the seagrass beds. Then within each quadrat, we recorded the location of that quadrat, so whether it was on the interior of the bed or on the edge of the bed, the count of reproductive structures, and the total coverage of seagrass. So the structures were recorded based on a 6-phase categorical system. So from left to right, the categories included bud, anthesis, denoting whether it was male or female flower, post-anthesis, which is not pictured here, fruit, post-dehiscence, and seedling. This categorical system was adopted from Phillips et al. In 1975. And gender determination of floral features was based on floral features that were outlined by Orpit and Borrell, as well as Tomlinson in the 1960s. So moving forward, I'll use the terms reproductive effort and flower density. For the purpose of this study, reproductive effort is essentially the sum of all of the stages within a quadrat. So it represents the total number of reproductive structures within each quadrat. Flower density includes all buds and open flowers. So in addition to collecting botanical information, we've collected physical water quality measurements of overlying bottom water at each site. Parameters included salinity, temperature, DO, and pH, but for the analysis, we only focused on salinity and temperature since they are known to affect seagrass reproduction. So moving on to some of the results. During the survey, the salinity ranged from about 28 to 34 PSU. Additionally, salinity declined at all of the locations throughout the survey. The most substantial decline was at the Cockroach Bay sites, which had a 4 and 3.8 PSU drop from May to July. On the other hand, Coquina Key sites, we had the lowest range of salinity and the most stable conditions. Results from the study revealed that May was peak anthesis for in Tampa Bay. This is similar to previous studies that were done in the 1970s and then, or 1960s and 1970s. There was significant spatial variability of flowering both between and within sites. There was significantly lower flowering at sites that were adjacent to freshwater sources and large mangrove stands. Following large rain events, rivers and creeks can deliver significant amounts of fresh water to the estuary, which can result in salinity pulses. Because these areas are so close to mangroves, the water is often nutrient rich and can be very tannic. So these seemingly minor water quality alterations can have long-lasting negative effects on seagrass habitats. Freshwater pulses are known to reduce biomass accumulation and reduce seagrass productivity. So it could be that these water quality changes could be limiting the sufficient storage required for sexual reproduction, which is very energetically expensive. Additionally, freshwater pulses have been known to result in stress-induced flower senescence, which was observed in Tampa Bay in the 1970s. This data suggests that salinity is likely the strongest condition limiting flowering in Tampa Bay. Results also indicated that there was significantly greater flowering on the interior of the bed as opposed to on the edge of the bed. This is likely a result of short shoot age because, as I mentioned earlier, short shoots typically don't reach sexual maturity until about 2 years of age. Generally, the edge of the beds are associated with initial colonization and thus are too young to undergo sexual reproduction. For gender ratios, the ratios were varied greatly and were often very skewed. Some sites had high numbers of females, while others had high numbers of males. In the field, the genders were often isolated into separate and distinct patches and rarely mixed. The only sites where the ratios were close to 1 included both Coquina Key sites as well as the Egmont Key site. Fruiting, peak fruiting was observed in June. This provides new information that restoration managers and resource managers can use to be more efficient and targeted in future management strategies. Similar to flowering, fruiting was extremely patchy, both between and within sites. However, patchiness has been previously documented in Tampa Bay. Fruiting was notably greater at both of the Coquina Key sites. This may be a result of some of those gender ratio dynamics. As I said, Coquina Key were the only sites where male and female flower ratios were similar. These were also the only sites where male and female flowers co-mingled. Abiotic pollinators often also release large quantities of poor quality pollen. So pollen is only active for a few hours and can be hindered in movement by those hydrodynamic features and meadow structure. So these conditions present significant challenges to successful sexual reproduction and pollination in areas where sexes are isolated. Additionally, Coquina Key is a sandy protected shoal and separated from any major freshwater source. Therefore, environmental conditions are very stable at the site, as we saw in our stable salinity and temperature measurements. Stable environments often result in higher rates of productivity and biomass accumulation. So across all sites, evidence of successful sexual reproduction, as shown by dehisced fruits, was extremely low. Fruit dehiscence is a valuable tool for determining successful sexual reproduction. However, it does present its challenges. Fruit pieces degrade rapidly after the fruit dehisces, and those fragments are often high in sugary carbohydrates and can be a target for herbivory. So it could be that those two factors resulted in the low number of fruit dehiscent counts that we saw. We also saw many aborted fruits during the survey. We saw dark legions on the peduncle, which is the part where the fruit is actually borne onto the plant. And so we saw dark legions, which may suggest that a fungus or virus is causing the abortion. There have been reported studies that reported fungal growth on 20 to 80% of the samples taken in the Gulf of Mexico. However, aborted fruits are not uncommon and can be caused from poor pollen quality, lack of adequate resources, and erratic environmental conditions like those rapid salinity shifts. So seedling presence is a strong indicator of successful sexual reproduction and recruitment of new genetic material into established beds. Unfortunately, we only saw 7 seedlings throughout the entire course of the survey. Herbivory is reported as one of the strongest regulators of seedling recruitment. Tampa Bay is home to a very robust pinfish population, and they are considered to be the dominant fish species in Thalassia meadows. The diet of pinfish typically shifts, becoming increasingly dominated by plant material. So during the study, we did observe large pinfish consuming reproductive structures. Fish typically target meals that are high in sugars and carbohydrates, which include both fruits and seedlings. So therefore, herbivory is likely the strongest condition limiting seedling recruitment. And new genetic material. This just emphasizes the importance of considering the entire trophic community to fully understand habitat resilience. So in conclusion, May is peak anthesis when June is peak fruiting. There is significant spatial variability of reproductive structures, including flowering, sex ratios, fruiting, and seedlings, both within and among sites. Sexual reproduction is dominantly performed by older shoots in the interior of the bed as opposed to on the edges. And freshwater pulses and herbivory are likely limiting sexual reproduction and success in Tampa Bay. Finally, all of this information supports that asexual reproduction is the dominant form of expansion in Tampa Bay. Because sexual reproduction results in genetic diversity, seagrasses in Tampa Bay are likely limited in genetic diversity and may be vulnerable to future stressors, including impacts from climate change. So this study reveals that while we have made significant strides and achieved many successes in Tampa Bay, management to protect these habitats is far from complete. We need to increase management and begin managing for genetic diversity. The study proposes locations where sexual reproduction is already being successful to enhance that success and increase the amount of new genetic material. We could set out pinfish exclusion devices and then possibly use those seedlings to restore crop scars or other priority locations in the bay. But as we have yet to feel the full effects of climate change and sea level rise, we must recognize our dependence on seagrass habitats' adaptability and long-term resilience. Therefore, it is critical that we start managing not only for enhanced seagrass acreage, but also for sexual reproduction and increased genetic diversity. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Sheila. Much appreciated. Yeah. For me, it's a good reminder that while we do focus and from the data, our management focus has been maintained on the rhizomatous increase of seagrasses. We do have those sexual reproduction for Thalassia and possibly the other seagrasses in the system. I'd like to start. What do you think is this applicable going down south to Sarasota and Charlotte Harbor? Are there limitations?
I think it is very much applicable. However, I think in the recent years, Sarasota and some of the southern regions have seen losses and their habitats are showing signs of stress. So the seagrasses may not have the carbohydrate storage then to direct that storage to sexual reproduction. They might be focusing directly on asexual reproduction. But I think it's definitely something we should be looking at. So yeah, Dave.
So not really a question, but like, kind of like a challenge, which is the kind of work you're doing and the kind of work Brad Furman's done on Haladuli. I think that's going to be more important for us, at least in Sarasota Bay. We got a big chunk, seagrass loss. And we, if we get our water clarity back, then the question is, will the seagrass come back by itself? You know, is there a seed source there? Or should we just kind of sit around and wait a couple of years for it to come back? Or can we maybe jumpstart restoration if the water quality comes about? So the type of work you did, the kind of work that Brad Furman's done in the past, I think that's going to be more important for us in the future rather than the past, because we have to, you know, kind of stabilize our water quality in the upper part of the bay. But once we do that, if we can do it, then the next question is, is there anything we can do to jumpstart restoration in an area where we've lost, you know, thousands of acres in a big black hole or red blob? So I really appreciate the work you're doing. A couple of years ago, I wouldn't have thought it would be necessary for us to move towards restoration to involve, you know, sexual reproduction, but maybe we do now. So just thanks for all your work.
Thanks, Dave. I definitely.
Sheila, related that, Chris A wants to know if there's a way to predict the areas where seagrasses are more likely to reproduce sexually versus asexually.
I think from my research, at least, I would focus on areas that have like on sandy shoals and are separated from any significant freshwater source.
Yeah, and Sheila, I just want to echo too what Dave said about, you know, this is really great work, and I guess my question was geared a lot towards what Dave just said, which is that, you know, are there places that we can potentially predict that we would expect to see more sexual reproduction, and I think that will help guide us as to, you know, are there areas where we need to actively go in and, you know, and restore an area that maybe doesn't have a viable seed bank, or the, you know, the below ground rhizomes are just gone. So that's kind of where I was coming from. So thank you.
Yeah, like I said, I think that's a really good question, and I have a ton of data that I haven't even started looking at yet. So those types of questions can help me formulate. I have some data that would help me be able to answer some of those questions. But yeah, I agree. Like I said, I would focus on sort of like sandier areas, separated from major freshwater sources. I would expect those areas to be have increased sexual reproduction. And again, this is focusing specifically on Thalassia. It's Haliduli and Halophila, and some of those other species are entirely different animals. But with that in mind, then I would also, some of the things that I found was that the density, there might be like a Goldilocks density, so we could be using density to fold that in to prioritize locations or hypothesize areas that might be undergoing sexual reproduction. So hopefully more information to come with my many publications that are going to come out of this data.
I think we've got time for the one more question that's in the chat from Mark Walton. Has there been any historical recorded mass die-offs through seagrass disease that might be related to low genetic diversity?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that there have been die-offs or suggestions for certain funguses that affected large areas. I don't think that it was directly a result of genetic diversity, but I think that's something that we, like I said, need to focus on in the future, because we are going to be having these different fungi and viruses affect our ecosystems, and we have in the past, and they have the potential to wipe out areas if there is limited sexual reproduction and there's basically only a couple plants, essentially, very large plants.
Wasn't there a die-off in Florida Bay that was attributed to a disease like many years ago? Or am I making that up?
The die-off in Florida Bay was related to hydrogen sulfide and hydrogen sulfide and basically lack of hypersalinity, essentially.
Okay, but that's a good question, because that brings up this whole idea of sublethal stress, that, you know, if your grasses are just kind of hanging on, then it would make them more prone to disease. Maybe that becomes more of an issue in suboptimal grass beds where, you know, the grass are there, but they're not really doing too well.
Right.
All right. Thanks y'all very much. So Marcus, are you ready to go?
Sure am, Gary.
Okay. Our next speaker is Marcus Beck, the program scientist for the Tampa Bay Estuary program, and he will be talking about some open science tools that he has developed recently to present our annual seagrass transect monitoring data.
All right, thanks, Gary. Good morning, everybody. I'm the program scientist for the Tampa Bay Estuary program. I've been in this role for about 1.5 years now, and it's been my duty over the last 1.5 years to basically work with all of the data sets that we use as an organization to sort of bring them up to the surface and develop tools around how we synthesize that information and report on it for not just our goals as an estuary program, but how these reporting products can help our larger community understand changes in the bay as they occur and make informed decisions from them as a result. So obviously a big focus of what we do is looking at seagrasses and how they've changed over time. And so what I want to talk about today is some of the tools that we've developed around seagrass reporting. As we know, we have the coverage maps from the district that Chris was talking about this morning, but we also have this very nice data set of transect monitoring that has been going on since the 90s. That is an alternative source of information that we can use to understand changes in seagrass communities. So I've been over the last couple of months looking at that data set, thinking about some of the analysis tools and reporting products that can come out of using that data source. And I want to talk to you about what the work has been bringing those data sets to the surface and how you can use them to get a better sense of changes in seagrass. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the products we've created. I'm gonna do a live demo of a dashboard that we've recently created, and I'm going to talk about some of the analysis tools and actually the software products that we've developed to bring those data to the surface. And hopefully through doing that, you can understand how you can actually get your hands on this information in a more accessible way than maybe has been done in the past. And I also want to just sort of throughout, I have some highlights of recent status and trends that we've seen that again mirror what we've seen overall in the coverage maps, but again, using the Transect data as a complement to support and maybe develop a more informed understanding of the changes we're seeing in these different types of data sets. So I'll be hitting on some of those as well. So yes, you know, most of what we've been talking about this morning has focused on the coverage maps. I'm not going to repeat a lot of what Chris said in terms of what those data products really provide to us. But what I'll be talking about now is the Transect data. And if you're not familiar with what those data products are, I know this Transect data sets throughout the entire southwest coast of Florida, but I'll be focusing mostly on the Tampa side of things. Essentially, what we do at TBEP is we facilitate the collection of those data. Gary in particular does that. And so we coordinate monitoring efforts through our partners. Every year we have training. Actually, that's going to be coming up next couple of months, where we get all of our partners together and sort of make sure that they're up to speed on field protocols that are used for getting this information. But we train them up and we make sure they go out to their respective transects and they collect that information. They upload it to a centralized database, and we actually have about 30 years of data to assess from this resource. And these give us really spatially referenced information of specific transects at the same location over the last 30 years, where we have information on what species are at each transect, where they're located, what the frequency occurrence is of these individual species, and we can use that as a long-term record to really look at change over time at each individual site. And so this is a map of where those transects are collected, again, where we have about 30 years of data, 25, 30 years of data so far, and each color here represents a monitoring partner that we work with that goes out and collects this information. So we have about maybe 10 or so different institutions that are collecting this information that we're coordinating. And again, at each site, we have about 30 years of data where we can look at and assess long-term changes. So if you want to get your hands on this information and really get a hold of the indicator products that we've produced from this data set, you can navigate to this website here, and actually I've got this loaded on my end, so I'll just go there and show you where we're at. I can exit out of here. Sorry. Can't seem to exit my full screen. Anyway, you can go to this web page, and this is sort of our list of where we've got all of these products. This is our landing page on the TBEB website. Actually, just go over here. Yep. So you can see a link to the dashboard, a link to a report card here that I'll explain in a second of what that is, and then links to some of our other reporting products. But basically, this is your one-stop shop to get to the software, the dashboard, some technical documents. Let me get back to my presentation here. Hey. Sorry. There we go. All right, I won't do full screen anymore. Back to my presentation here. A lot of this really revolves around this software that we developed. So the dashboard we created, the plots and the features that you see on there are all within this open source software package that we've developed. And I want to just talk a little bit about what this package provides if you want to use it on your own end. If you don't want to use it, that's fine. You can use the dashboard to get there as well. But essentially, this software package lets you pull in all of the data for the Transect data in addition to the other data sets that we have for our reporting products. It lets you summarize that information. So again, 30 years of data is a lot. So we have functions to estimate frequency occurrence, create summary graphics, all that fun stuff. And really, it's the workhorse that we've created for all of our reporting products. So we want to have that available as a resource for anybody to download and use if they want to go forth and use that information on their own, if you don't want to go the dashboard route. So I want to just highlight a few features of this. This is developed in the R programming language, which if you're not familiar with that, that's an open source analysis program that anyone can use and download. And I just want to emphasize how easy it is to basically pull in this information and summarize it on your own. And so this is basically showing some R code where you can basically load the package, pull in the data. This is a function that actually pulls in the database from the USF Water Atlas where this information is housed. And then you see essentially what amounts to basically 130,000 records of the 30 years of data that we have for the Transect. So in a matter of seconds, you can pull in all of this data and start working with it on your own, which is something that we weren't able to do prior to the development of this software. This is another function we have that is in this software where you can basically, when you import the data, you can summarize it in different ways. This is just basically showing you how you can summarize the Transect data to get frequency occurrence estimates at each individual transect and each date where we have this information. So again, sort of a huge synthesis of data analysis here happening in one line of code. And then you could report on that. So once you have that data imported and summarized, you can create these summary graphics that provide you with an overview of what's happening at these transects over time. So this is an example of the trends at Transect S1 T16, which is in Old Tampa Bay in between Courtney Campbell and Howard Franklin Bridge on the southwest edge of Old Tampa Bay. But what we have here is essentially each row here is 1 year of data. So going from the oldest transect to the most recent transect, and each point along the x-axis is a point along the transect that's been surveyed. So you can see each species here is color-coded. So Rupia, blue, Haliduli in this pink color, Thalassia in green, Syringodium in this olive color. And so you can get a sense of where these species have occurred along the transect, but also how they've maybe changed over time. And what's cool about these graphics is they're all interactive. You can zoom in and mouse over and sort of look at a very fine spatial scale what's happening at this transect over time. This is another plotting function we have where we're still looking at changes over time, but we've actually summarized the species estimates into frequency values. So we have time on the x-axis in this case, and then we have frequency occurrence on the y-axis, so you can kind of get a more generalized view of what has happened to the changes in species over time at this transect. So this is just kind of an alternative way to look at the species changes over time. And so we also have functions that let you look at overall changes in frequency occurrence across the entire bay. So those last two ones were just showing you what's happening in individual transects, but here we're showing basically what is the entire frequency occurrence across the entire bay, summarizing results for all of the transects. So again, just with one line of code, you can do that. Here we see sort of the total frequency occurrence for all species, and then individual species color-coded below that. And so this, of course, mirrors the long-term improvements in seagrass that we know has happened in Tampa Bay, and then kind of this more recent decline that is being reflected in the coverage maps as well. So that's a time series there. We also have a report card. If you're familiar with some of the other reporting products we produce at the Estuary program, we like to put out a lot of report cards, and so we have something very similar for the seagrass data. What this is showing you is essentially summarized frequency occurrence values for all species down to the segment level. So we have the entire bay here, and then average frequency occurrence for the major bay segments in Tampa Bay. And so a couple things about this is, we decided not to use your, conventional red, yellow, green stoplight graphic here, which we normally do for most of our report cards. And that's basically based on the idea that, we don't necessarily know what that line in the sand is for frequency occurrence that defines, a color break that could have some sort of implication in terms of what's good or what's bad. So we tried to make this a more neutral color scheme and a way to sort of just display this information more objectively. And this color ramp is continuous. So again, there's no breakpoints here that really define what's a significant change in frequency occurrence that could have some implication for ecological impacts. So this is the report card. You'll see this on the dashboard in a second, but you can again produce this with one line of code from the data that you can pull in from the water atlas with these functions. So I'll navigate to the dashboard now just to show you what's on there. Again, all of these functions I'm showing you are things you can get if you want to download the software and do this on your own. If you're not comfortable using R, you can go to the dashboard for that. Or if you want to learn how to do this in R, we have training resources online to facilitate that, or you can just get in touch with me and I could maybe walk you through that. But again, there are multiple ways to get at this information, and I want to emphasize that all of these things are interconnected, and there's more than one way to get to these products depending on what your level of comfort is. So going to the dashboard now, I have that here. So this would be, I believe this link was dropped in the chat more than once, but you can load this up. We have this overview page first that kind of explains what this dashboard is all about. But like most of our dashboards, we try to go from sort of these high level overviews to more specific information in terms of the order of the appearance of the different tabs. So if you start at this overall summary, you see a map of the transects and then these sort of high level summaries of what's going on with frequency occurrence as a whole in the bay and then the different segments. So what sets this apart is you can, subset different parts of the bay if you want. So here I'm just pulling out different bay segments. So if I wanted to look at just Hillsborough Bay and Old Tampa Bay or Old Tampa Bay alone, I could do that. And so as I remove the different segments, you see the graphics updating in kind. I can look at different year ranges, whatever I want. I can pull out different species if I want to look at just the results related to different species of interest there. So all this is interactive. This lets you, sort of pick and choose the pieces you want to look at. Going a little bit deeper, we can look at the individual transects. And so this is where you wanted to look at, say, if you were concerned about, say, what's going on in Feather Sound. This came up earlier when Chris was talking. We could pull that up. So this is transect S1T17. So I select that, you see the graphics update in kind. We can see the long-term changes from the oldest record to the most recent. And again, we can pick and choose different species we want to look at. So here I'm just subsetting different ones. Obviously, Haliduli would be the dominant one at this transect over time. So if I want to look at maybe what are some of the other changes in the other species, I can take out Haliduli or put it back in, depending on what I want. Just to emphasize a point that Chris made, we actually had an option here to put Caulerpa back in as an attached algae, because this is an interesting phenomenon we're seeing where it looks like in some places Caulerpa is replacing the seagrass species, and we don't know really the mechanism behind that, and we don't know the implications of whether or not that's a good, bad, or neutral change in terms of the habitat benefits or services that it provides. But you can see these changes quite well in these graphics here. And so we see in the last 3 years at the Feather Sound, Caulerpa has really kind of become the dominant species here that has replaced the other seagrass. So that's interesting. The other tab that you can look at is Seagrass Edge. This was my attempt to try to track that change in the different transects. This is kind of an experimental tab. As we know, that the Seagrass Edge, tracking that over time can be a sensitive indicator of changes in water clarity, and oftentimes that's an informative piece of information to look at in terms of different dynamics, different metrics we could use to assess changes in the seagrass condition. So I have that tab there. It's kind of, again, an experimental tab. It might be informative to look at. And then if you want to get your hands on the data, we have these various download tabs here. So I have it set up to where you can download the entire data set in this tab, where we have the data split out by date, transect, and then different points along the transect in meters and the species and metrics you have there. Or if you want to download the data in a slightly summarized format, I have the data summarized by frequency occurrence here, so sort of collapsing it across the different sites within each transect to get that information. Or if you want a lat long file of the transects, they're here, and then you can see the different what the fields are in each data set if you're curious there. So that's the dashboard. It's a work in progress. It's kind of a fairly new product. We're making changes to these things as we get feedback from folks on how useful it is. But that's there for your use. And again, I want to emphasize not only the availability of these products as they're new coming out for you guys, but what are some of the interesting trends we're seeing. And so these are themes that I think are echoed in some of the other presentations today, but again, I just want to reiterate what we've seen so far, particularly in the last year or two with these recent changes that we're seeing, not only in Tampa Bay, but maybe in other parts of the southwest coast of Florida. So what's interesting, if you look at actually the changes from 2019 to 2020, we see a reduction in frequency occurrence overall, which is kind of interesting for Tampa Bay, particularly in Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, and that does reflect what we were seeing in the coverage maps that Chris was showing earlier. So it's nice when we have these different lines of evidence, these different data sets sort of showing us the same thing. And this increase in Clearwater is something that might be an interesting research avenue to pursue. You know, what's driving that? What does it mean in terms of benefits for what these different species provide for ecosystem services or whatnot? And then finally, you know, it would be good to sort of actually really combine the coverage data sets with the Transect data sets in a way where we can actually leverage both sources rather than looking at them separately. And maybe there's some ways that we could do that to sort of make inferences about acreage estimates and the particular species that are corresponding to those different acreage changes. And I think there might be a way to reconcile that as a way to move forward with doing these analyses. And I just want to draw to everyone's attention that, you know, we do have a coverage dashboard. I've been talking about the Transect data, of course, but with the coverage maps, this is obviously a great resource. And with a lot of these open science or these open reporting products, we want to make the most out of all of these different data sets. And so I have been developing a coverage dashboard as kind of a complementary piece of information here where, you know, you can pull up different years of data and maybe draw custom polygons around areas of interest. Here I'm just looking at Feather Sound again, and then, you know, looking at what has actually been sort of the seagrass change between the 2 year pairs as a more detailed look at that. It's understanding, like, you know, has continuous seagrass moved to algae or sand, that sort of thing. And so that's something to look forward to. I haven't really publicized this dashboard fully yet because there's some development that I need to do to make this a more accessible product, but that is something I'm hoping to release in the next couple of months. So just look forward to that. So that's pretty much all I wanted to show you today, just to make you aware that, you know, we've developed these tools mostly in a Tampa Bay focus, but these are things that I think could help everyone sort of develop a more comprehensive understanding of what's going on, these changes in the seagrass using the Transect data. So I welcome your feedback on these things. These are all the links you can use to get to them, both the dashboard as well as the software that we've developed to actually get into the underlying code to get these data on your own. So I'll take some feedback if there's time or if there's questions. I'd be glad to entertain a few. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, it's an incredible data resource that we've been lucky to have produced for us, and along with all the other open science products that Marcus has been bringing to the table. Right now, the only question in there so far is regarding Halophila engelmannii versus decipiens. I believe that there have been some vouchered specimens, maybe in like Ogasiega Bay or Clearwater Harbor. I'm not sure if any decipiens is seen in the bay. Anybody else?
Yeah, on the dashboard and the products we have, we're just, everything's to genus for Halophila. I don't know if it's in the data, the raw data, if it's discriminated down to species. Gary, I don't know if you know the answer to that.
Roger might. Online.
Yeah,
Roger's online.
It's Halophila engelmannii.
Yeah, I can't recall any decipiens reported in the data set, and that sounds like Roger's recollection too.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a question in here. Are there plans to extend the tools beyond Tampa Bay? Are the codes and graphing capabilities able to be applied to other Transect data sets?
Short answer is yes. That's one of the reasons we produce these things in an open format. You know, they're designed for anybody to not just download and use the software, but the source code is all openly available. And, you know, if you have the bandwidth or skill set to sort of apply that to alternative data sets, it's possible. You know, I know that we do have similar Transect data sets available outside of Tampa Bay. and I'm open to exploring how we can integrate those alternative data sets within the existing tools. So that's kind of the point of all this. I want to make these tools available to others beyond our region. And the extent that we can do that, the extent that I can work with you all to make them available, just get in touch and we'll see what we can do. That's kind of the name of the game for all this.
Okay. And something from Nicole Idavia, great tool set, more of a comment. We appreciate the building and sharing through Open Science, and Coastal Heartland would like to coordinate, possibly take on looking at data in a similar fashion from down south. So they will be in touch.
My email inbox is always open.
Right. Thank you so much, Marcus. Lewis, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, if you'll go ahead and you should be able to share your screen. Let me know if you have any problems.
It seems that I'm not able to.
Okay, hang on just a second. Right, I've got it. Give it a try now.
Yeah.
Okay. So our final talk is bringing the information full circle. Luis Lascano Sandoval is a doctoral candidate at the College of Marine Science, University of South Florida, working with Frank Muller-Carter, and he is going to talk about satellite mapping of seagrasses within Southwest Florida. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you, Gary. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm glad to show some preliminary results of my PhD research. My research seeks to map and detect changes in seagrass area at regional scales. And in this presentation, I'm going to show some results for the state of Florida. So this is the seagrass distribution in Florida that most of us know. The seagrass area in Florida is about 30,000 square kilometers. This includes the discontinuous and continuous seagrass areas. This distribution map has been made from the interpretation of aerial photography in different regions by several agencies, but also a few regions have been mapped using satellite imagery. The whole data set is distributed by the FWRI. The aerial mapping has continued in some regions every 2 years, 4 years, but there are other regions which have not been mapped in 10 or more years. So this is a natural issue because we don't know how much the rate of change in seagrass cover is for several regions. This is why satellite imagery is an important tool for detecting ecosystem distributions, areal extents, and also changes over time. This is even more accessible now with platforms like Google Earth Engine, which allows the users to analyze geospatial and satellite data from very large collections in the cloud. And also we can use the speed of the supercomputers from Google. So for example, some useful satellite data is that from Landsat and Sentinel missions, from which we can have access to 35 years of data. There are some differences between these satellite sensors. Some of them are the pixel resolution, which is 3 meters for Landsat and 10 meters for Sentinel. And also a very important difference between Sentinel and Landsat is the revisit frequency of the satellite. So for example, Sentinel takes a picture every 5 days and Landsat every 16 days. So we can have access to about 3 times more images with Sentinel in a year than with Landsat. But also it is good that the Landsat missions or the Landsat satellites overlap in some years, which allows to explore more images with similar characteristics. Now, the Landsat 7, Landsat 8, and Sentinel-2 are active missions, but the images of Landsat 7 present gaps after 2003 due to a failure in the sensor. So some images are useful and others not much. So how can we use these images for detecting seagrass? Basically, the satellite sensor captures the reflectance of the objects on the Earth surface. So we can use that reflectance values or signatures from different objects that we can see in a satellite image. Then we can just train a classifier, and then we can just produce a map according to that. Things get more complicated when we have to map very large scales. So, for example, to cover the coastal areas of Florida with presence of seagrasses, we need 22 tiles for Sentinel and 16 tiles for Landsat. This means there is a lot of images available in a year. So there is about 1,600 images for Sentinel and 368 for Landsat. However, not all of the images are useful for seagrass mapping. We want to select images with good visibility in atmosphere and water. So how can we detect that? Well, we can first filter the collections by cloud cover. In this case, I'm using images with less than 30% in cloud cover. Then we can filter more images based on the reflectance mean values of the red edge and red bands and water pixels from each image in the collection. So this is a lot of computation, but it is also possible thanks to the power of Google Earth Engine. We can see in the plot the mean reflectance values at 704 nanometers as blue dots. We can see the sun zenith angles as orange dots. Every dot represents an image of the pre-filtered Sentinel-2 collection for Florida over 2019. So images with lower red reflectance values and higher sun zenith angles are best for the seagrass mapping because we can see the water is more clear. So usually the high reflectance values at 704 nanometers are associated to suspended sediments, clouds, also sun glint in water surface. So the red dots in the plot represent the three images to the right. So we can see how the reflectance at 704 nanometers looks like in clear waters with some seagrass there. And also we can see how it looks in waters of high turbidity and waters with sun glint. So in those images, we cannot see anything below the water surface. So we just discard those images because are not useful for seagrass mapping. So using this approach, I was able to select 167 out of more than 1,200 images here. Most of the selected images are found in the first and last month of the year, which makes sense because those are usually the months when water is less turbid. So after selecting the best images, we can proceed to correct the atmospheric and water column effects. We can use those images to get the reflectance values of different bottom types. In this case, seagrass, hard bottom, and soft bottom. I collected about 32,000 ground points based on maps and literature, some descriptions. I used also the FWRI dataset, also some visual interpretations. So I use the coastal blue, green, and red bands plus the green blue band ratio, which is derived from the depth invariant index technique, which compensates the effect of water column on bottom reflectance. The reflectance values are used to train the classifier. In this case, I'm using a support vector machine classifier. Then just produce a classified map for each image. The final product is a mosaic from all of those classified images. More than 7,800 square kilometers of seagrass was detected using the Sentinel-2 imagery for 2019, and this product can be visualized in the link below. The estimated seagrass area was lower than the reported in the FWRI dataset for continuous or dense seagrass. So there is about 7.8% difference in area. These results are only comparable to the dense or continuous seagrass areas. Given that the sparse seagrass areas are hardly detected by the satellite imagery at different resolutions. If we compare the satellite and aerial mapping products, we can see that the continuous seagrass areas match very well, but the discontinuous or sparse seagrass is not detected by the satellite image, at least at 10-meter resolution. So at different resolutions, the objects in the image looks different. This is an example of an aerial photograph at 1 meter resolution per pixel, Sentinel-2 at 10 meters, Landsat 8 at 30 meters resolution. So basically the major patterns in the image remain similar, but small patches or small features might not be captured either by Sentinel or the Landsat sensor. So the image resolution is a limitation for mapping seagrass densities, but I will say that it is not for detecting the dense seagrass areas. And how much the difference is between the different resolutions? Well, there is about 3% difference in seagrass cover using two different images from different resolutions. In this case, Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2. But the mapping, I would say that the mapping using Sentinel-2, it might be more precise due to the higher number of images available, which allows us to reduce any interannual variability in seagrass extent. These are some preliminary results of historical changes in seagrass area for the last 30 years in the Clearwater and Tampa Bay regions. The satellite mapping was made in 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2019 using Landsat 5, Landsat 7, and Sentinel-2 imagery. We can see in the plot that there has been a continuous increase over the last 30 years. The trends of seagrass area estimated by satellite mapping matches very well to those from aerial mapping in both regions. Here we can see different areas that gain seagrass over the different periods. How much we can see how much the change was. In the map, we can see the blue regions means that the seagrass area that was gained. Also, we can see that in the plot, the seagrass cover increased in Tampa Bay since 2000. And also the seagrass cover has been increasing continuously in the Clearwater region over the last 3 decades. So we can attribute those increases in seagrass cover to the changes in chlorophyll concentration inside Tampa Bay. The chlorophyll concentration is an indicator of water quality, especially for nutrients and clarity. So the in situ data from the Environmental Protection Commission shows that the interannual variability and the trends over the last 3 decades has been decreasing. It means that the water quality has been improving. So also we can see how bad the 1990s decade was for water quality and seagrass cover. But after that, after the 2000s, we can see how the seagrass cover increased as the water quality is improved. So, well, this is all that I got so far. I will try to evaluate other possible drivers such as temperature to better understand the seagrass dynamic, not only in Tampa Bay, but other regions in Florida. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Luis. You know, this sort of goes back to the discussion that Chris Anastasia was having regarding, using those automated systems. This is even a higher level, and recognizing that we need to make sure that what we're using going forward, we can relate to the previous work that's gone on. There's a question from Ed Sherwood in the chat asking about, is there any imagery available yet from 2020 or 2021?
Yeah, there is imagery available, but the mapping, I just did the mapping last year, so I just got the 2019 imagery available for that moment. So that's why I don't have the maps for the 2020 yet.
And okay, thank you on that. Dave, do you have a question, Tomasco?
Yeah, I think this is a really important tool. I think that it makes me nervous at the same time. This plot right here shows chlorophyll trends continuing. Those are all positive slopes right there. And so it doesn't really show the message that we've been giving for a long time, which is, the clear reduction over time. So I'm not saying I don't like this technique. I think there are places where this technique definitely is needed. I mean, you've heard Charlotte Harbor, the southern part of Charlotte Harbor doesn't get the attention that we have in the other part. But like when you go back 1 or 2 slides of the seagrass trend, it's a different story what we have in this presentation than what we went through in the first hour and a half. And I think it's a good tool. I just would caution that, multiple techniques of mapping are appropriate, I think, but we need to be careful about how to interpret it. Because if I look at the last couple of slides on the seagrass trend, I don't see a reason for concern in Tampa Bay. Now, the timeline is a little bit different, but yeah, look at those 2 lines. They're different. And so I just want to caution us that, we want to be consistent with how we interpret what's happening in the Bay. And if I look at that top one right there, it looks like, what are you worried about? We're doing good. And that's not the message we just got from the first hour and a half.
Yeah, that's true. We can see that the increase in seagrass area is being continuous, but also I think that this kind of techniques allows us to see or evaluate where were the areas where we observe more gainings and losses in seagrass. But of course, I think that this is a great tool. We can just do this for other regions. So this is the advantage of using satellite imagery as well.
Yeah, and I don't mean to suggest it's not useful. I simply would suggest that we have to be careful about how, the messaging of what you're seeing there. And I do want to like throw back to like how important it is for the field verification of what the images are actually saying, because those are very similar. I think that the easiest thing to do, frankly, would be to like use this to supplement the places where we don't have good ongoing, since the numbers are pretty similar, then I think you have proof of concept of this. So how about applying this in Biscayne Bay in the southern part of Charlotte Harbor? That way you don't have a conflict with a more detailed, longer time period, because the fact that they're very similar is good, but the subtlety of what you have there versus the first hour and a half is important, that it doesn't blow up in messaging. Do you have a problem or don't you have a problem in Tampa Bay? It depends upon whether I'm watching your presentation or the first hour and a half.
Right.
Did I hear somebody else trying to chime in? Okay, Chris A has a question. How do you discriminate between RS from the water column versus RS from the bottom?
Good question. In this case, there is the classifier takes uses this band, the green and blue ratio values, which is used this is compensating the effect of the water column. So this is like a combination of compensation of the water column against the surface reflectance. So the classifier is able to discriminate the different features in the image by using those different bands. Also, it is good because several areas are very shallow, so the effect of the water column is very small.
We have one more question in the chat. Looks like you're looking at images every 10 years. Are there more photographs or images available that could look more particularly at those changes, as Dave was suggesting?
Yeah, we can use the imagery for every single year, but that means that of course we need more time to analyze, process every image. As you can saw, there is a lot of images per year to process. So this is why I just took every 10 years.
Okay. Anyone else right now? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Luis. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luis.
Again, thank you all so much for all the work that's gone on. I went ahead and recognizing the discussions that we've had, put just a quick Menti single slide together to try to understand, thinking about our next steps. And assuming that we probably should have some additional discussion, how just a real quick question on how y'all would prefer to see some follow-up. Do we want to have a standalone workshop potentially either later this summer or in the probably early 2022? We do have BASIS in late October. That's also an Association of National Estuary Program meeting, and multiple people who are on this call will be involved there. And then, as a third option, do we not need this group to have this discussion?
Hey Gary, this is Chris.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so we were just looking at your choices, and I would advocate for both a standalone workshop and an integrated workshop at BASIS for two different purposes. So I think the what now, like what do we do now, or the cause and effect, I think that would be a really good workshop for basis. But there were a lot of other things that I think would be good to talk about more with respect to the integration of Transect data with aerial data and some of the mapping conventions that we talked about that might lend itself more to a standalone workshop or workshops that would be really more specific to those folks that are really involved in the production of some of these products. So I would advocate for both.
I definitely appreciate that. I can't remember how this was set up, if you can actually vote for both. So I apologize.
You can. That's why I brought it up, because we were trying to select more than one.
Okay, well, we're seeing some votes roll in. Again, definitely, we're coming to the end of our time for this. Definitely appreciate the attention that y'all have applied to this, and the work that's gone into these different components. I think we have some definite, obviously, questions that we need to try to answer over the next year plus as we're going forward. Chris, do you have any final thoughts for the morning?
I just want to, reiterate that it was great to at least virtually see everybody and be a part of this workshop. I think we have an amazing group, and I want to continue to work with all of you guys to really get at the next steps, which I think is really where we're heading, is to not only understand the cause and effect, but ultimately what can we as a community do about it. So I just want to thank everybody for being here, and appreciate all the great feedback. And like I said, this isn't the last time you're going to see either me or Nate. You'll probably get sick of seeing us, but this is good stuff. So let's keep going.
Dave's got his hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to say I really appreciate the level of effort that went into this. We've been prepped for this. We kind of knew how bad it is. For those who are interested, our next TAC meeting is not going to include this, because this is basically already known. We'll give it as an attachment. Our next TAC meeting is going to focus on what are you going to do about it. And we're focusing on different types of techniques for stormwater, wastewater, in water, on the landscape, because that's where we're pivoting. We're pivoting towards, another bit of news. We have a problem in Sarasota Bay. What are we now going to do about it? So for those who are interested in our next TAC, we're going to be focusing on the management response to another bit of information that suggests how problematic our bay has become over the last couple of years.
Thank you,
Hey,
Dave.
Dave, real quick, are your TAC meetings virtual, or are they in person only?
Sorry, our TAC meetings are virtual for now, and so anyone who wants to pop in, they're more than happy. Our next TAC meeting is probably going to be a full day event. We're going to spend the first morning, the first hours, 4 hours, talking about wastewater, stormwater retrofits, new technologies, carbon walls, denitrification basins, that sort of thing. And then the afternoon is going to be spent on, people who want to do things in the water, artificial reefs, that sort of stuff. So we actually, I think, have already got the information with this and everything else that we have a problem. Now we're pivoting towards, now what are you going to do about it?
Awesome. Thanks, Dave.
And we expect you there, Sheila.
I'll put it on my calendar.
Okay. Thank you all very much. So again, good to virtually see everybody. And if there's nothing else, much appreciated, and have a good weekend.
Thanks, Gary. Great
Thanks,
job.
Gary. Thanks, everybody.